Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story.
I didn't realize it at the time, but the night I went camping alone, someone in the woods was counting how long I stayed alive. I didn't realize it at the time, but the night I went camping alone, someone in the woods was counting how long I stayed alive. That's not something I understood in the moment. Back then, it just felt quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet you only notice once you stop moving and the world seems to hold its breath with you. I remember sitting in my car with the engine off, listening to the ticking sound as it cooled down, the faint hum in my ears slowly fading until there was nothing left but the wind brushing through the trees. I told myself this was exactly what I wanted. No notifications, no traffic. No voices bleeding through thin apartment walls at 3 a.m. Just me, a tent, and a few days off the grid. The clearing looked normal enough. Dark soil, pine needles crunching softly under my boots. Somewhere far away, something metallic tapped against itself in the wind. Slow and irregular, like it didn't care whether I heard it or not. I set my tent up methodically, the way I always do. Stakes driven in, zippers checked twice. Small, controlled movements. I felt relaxed, almost calm. That should have been my first warning, because when night finally settled in, it didn't arrive all at once. It crept. The sky dimmed by degrees, shadows stretching longer than they should have, until the forest around me stopped feeling empty and started feeling occupied. Not crowded, just aware. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the fabric shift every time I breathed. The zipper teeth pressed cold against my knuckles. Somewhere beyond the reach of my headlamp, something moved. Not fast, not loud, just enough to let me know it was there. Then it stopped. Perfectly, as if it had realized I was listening. I held my breath without meaning to, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The forest wasn't making noise anymore. No insects, no wind, no distant rustle of branches, just my heartbeat, loud and clumsy in my ears, and a faint sound I couldn't place at first. A soft, rhythmic scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. Like someone dragging something lightly across bark, then stopping to listen. I remember thinking about how thin the tent wall felt, how it suddenly seemed ridiculous to trust a layer of fabric and a zipper to separate me from whatever was out there. I remember reaching for my phone, the screen lighting up my hands in a pale blue glow. And the sound stopped instantly. That was the moment it hit me. Whatever was outside wasn't wandering. It wasn't lost. It wasn't curious. It was paying attention. And somewhere in the dark, just beyond where I could see, something was keeping track of me, waiting to see what I would do next. I was 28 when I started lying to myself in small, practical ways. Not big lies. Not the kind that sound dramatic when you repeat them out loud. More like the kind you can whisper to your own reflection while brushing your teeth and still believe, because they fit inside your mouth too easily. I'm fine. I just need time. I'm better off this way. The divorce papers were already signed, but the apartment still felt like it was waiting for someone to come back. My ex-wife's absence had weight. It settled into corners, into the empty half of the closet, into the quiet gap where her shampoo used to be in the shower. Even the furniture looked rearranged in a way that made the space feel unfamiliar, like I was staying in someone else's place for a week and forgot the layout, except I had been living there for months. I worked remotely as an IT consultant for a mid-sized company that treated its servers like sacred objects and its employees like replaceable parts. The pay was decent, the hours were flexible, and the work was the kind that kept you staring into bright screens long after the sun was down, chasing down small problems that felt urgent only because someone else had labeled them that way. Most nights, my living room glowed with the cold, bluish light of my dual monitors. My laptop fan had developed this uneven whir, like it was slightly off balance, and once you noticed it, you couldn't unhear it. It pulsed in the background of everything I did. Emails, tickets, Zoom calls where people talked about bandwidth issues with the same seriousness you'd use for a medical diagnosis. At around 2 a.m, when the neighborhood finally went still, the apartment made its own quiet little orchestra. The refrigerator would kick on with a low motor hum, a steady vibration that traveled through the cheap laminate floor and into the soles of my feet if I stood in the kitchen too long. The HVAC vent in the hallway would sigh every few minutes, pushing out air that never felt warm enough. Somewhere behind the walls, the building would creak and settle like it was shifting in its sleep. I didn't mind those sounds. In a strange way, I depended on them. They were proof that something was happening. Proof that time was still moving forward, even if I wasn't. It was the silence I didn't know how to handle. The kind you get after a phone call ends. After you close the laptop and there's nothing left to respond to. The kind that makes you realize how loud your own thoughts can be when no one interrupts them. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd drive to the gas station 2 blocks away just to buy something I didn't need. A bottle of water, a pack of gum. Whatever excuse my brain accepted. The station had this buzzing neon sign that washed the parking lot in pale red and blue, like the whole place was underwater. The lights never flickered, not once, but they still made everything look unstable, like the world had been color-corrected wrong. I'd park under the brightest bulb and sit there with the engine off, watching people come and go. A guy in a delivery uniform grabbing coffee, a woman in scrubs buying cigarettes, the occasional couple arguing softly beside a dented sedan. Ordinary life. The kind I used to be part of without thinking. Then I'd go back home and tell myself I'd sleep, and I'd end up staring at my ceiling until sunrise bled through the blinds in thin gray stripes. 3 months after the divorce, I started getting the itch to do something drastic. Not reckless, not dangerous, just different enough to reset the part of my brain that felt stuck. I had tried the normal stuff. I went to the gym for exactly 2 weeks. I downloaded meditation apps that told me to breathe and let the thoughts drift by, which was a funny thing to say to someone whose thoughts were the only things that ever stayed. I met friends for drinks and pretended to enjoy myself, laughing at jokes I barely heard because I was too busy scanning the room for nothing. Nothing worked. I kept circling back to the same idea late at night when the apartment felt like a sealed container full of stale air. Get away. Disappear for a little while. Go somewhere that didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't have reminders, didn't have memories attached to every piece of furniture. Camping had always been a part of my life. My dad was one of those men who believed you could solve most problems with a pocket knife and enough patience. He put me in Scouts young, taught me how to read a map and how to start a fire without lighter fluid, and how to tell the difference between a branch snapping because of wind and a branch snapping because something heavy just stepped on it. I wasn't naive about the wilderness. I wasn't the guy who wandered into the woods with a half-charged phone and a hoodie, expecting nature to cradle him like a therapist. I knew what preparation looked like. I knew what risks were real and which ones were just stories people told to scare each other around campfires. But I also knew something else. When you're deep enough into the woods, the problems you can't stop thinking about start to sound smaller. Not solved, just quieter. Like the trees are absorbing them, pulling them out of you slowly, one breath at a time. That's what I wanted. Just quiet. Clean quiet. The kind where the loudest sound is your own boots on pine needles, and you can finally hear yourself think without the constant background noise of modern life. So I made the decision the way I made most decisions back then, at an unreasonable hour, alone, with too much screen light in my face. It was close to 2 a.m. again. The refrigerator was humming steadily. The laptop fan was whining like a tired insect, and my inbox was empty for once. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I clicked through old tabs I'd left open for weeks. Forums, maps, threads titled with things like best off-grid spots and hidden sites nobody uses. I wasn't looking for a campground. I didn't want neighbors and laughter and car doors slamming in the dark. I wanted to be alone. Alone. In a place where no one would casually wander by my tent because they were looking for the bathroom. That was the logic I used. And for a few minutes, it worked. It felt like I was taking control of something, like I was doing something proactive, something that would fix the hollow feeling inside me. I didn't notice how tense my shoulders were until I stood up to stretch and felt the muscles in my neck ache like bruises. I didn't notice how dry my eyes were until I blinked and realized I'd been staring at the screen without moving. Outside my window, the neon from the gas station sign painted a faint, shifting glow across the far wall. Blue, then red, then blue again, depending on which part of the sign was visible from my angle. It made the apartment feel like it was breathing. I rubbed my face, reached for my water glass, and paused. Because for just a second, barely long enough to be sure, I thought I saw a shadow move across the blinds, not inside the apartment, not like something was behind me. Outside, on the other side of the glass, passing through the strip of streetlight that hit my window. I froze with my fingers still wrapped around the rim of the glass. The refrigerator kept humming. The laptop fan kept whining. The HVAC vent sighed softly down the hall. Nothing else happened. No knock, no footsteps in the hallway, no voices, no car alarm. Just the same late-night city quiet I'd heard 1,000 times. I told myself it was a car passing, headlights, a tree branch shifting in the wind. Anything that didn't require me to get up and look. And that's the part I still think about now, years later. The fact that I didn't even check. I just sat back down, stared at the screen, and kept searching for places to disappear. Because at the time I thought I was running away from my life. I didn't understand I might have already caught someone's attention. The idea didn't come to me all at once. It leaked in slowly, the way exhaustion does. Quiet, persistent, and hard to argue with. It was another late night. The kind where you tell yourself you'll shut everything down after one more thing. And suddenly it's past midnight, and your eyes feel gritty, like there's dust behind them. My laptop was still open on the coffee table, casting that familiar cold glow across the room. The fan whined softly, struggling to keep up, and every few minutes the refrigerator kicked on again, its hum filling the gaps between my thoughts. I wasn't even looking for camping spots at first, not intentionally. I started the way I usually did when I couldn't sleep, scrolling aimlessly, clicking links I didn't remember opening, following threads that branched into other threads until I forgot what I was originally searching for. Somewhere between a half-read article and an abandoned Reddit tab, I ended up on an old backcountry forum. It wasn't a slick website, no ads, no clean design, just a dark background, pale text, and usernames that hadn't been active in years. The kind of place that felt like it existed outside of time, quietly collecting conversations no one had bothered to clean up. The posts weren't ranked by popularity. There were no likes or reactions, just long strings of replies stacked on top of each other, some dating back more than a decade. That alone made it feel more trustworthy than most of the internet. I leaned back on the couch and started reading. People talked about unofficial sites, clearings that didn't show up on maps, spots you wouldn't find in guidebooks or apps. They used vague language, careful not to give anything too precise. Directions like, about 40 minutes past the old service road, or, you'll know you're close when the trees thin out. No coordinates, no exact markers, almost like they were afraid of being too specific. At first, it all felt harmless, familiar even. I'd grown up hearing that kind of talk. Old scouts, seasoned campers, people who liked the idea of having places that still felt undiscovered. There was a certain pride in knowing how to get somewhere without relying on GPS, in being able to read the land instead of a screen. I clicked through thread after thread, my finger hovering over the trackpad, scrolling slowly, absorbing details without really thinking about them. Some posts were practical. What to bring, what time of year to go, how long you could stay before it started to feel wrong. That word popped up more than once. Wrong. No explanation attached to it. Just dropped into sentences like an afterthought. Others were shorter, almost dismissive. Stayed there 2 nights. Won't be going back. Beautiful place. Don't recommend it alone. Hard to explain. Trust your gut. Those comments caught my attention more than the longer ones. They didn't sound like people trying to scare anyone. There was no drama in the way they were written. No exclamation points. No build-up. Just statements. Flat. Final. I told myself that was just the internet being the internet. People like to hint at things. Make places seem mysterious. It was part of the appeal. Still, I kept reading. One thread in particular pulled me in. It was old, at least 8 years, judging by the timestamps. The original post was from a user with a generic name, something like Trail Marker or Backcountry 77. They described a site deep in a national forest, accessible only by a service road that didn't appear on most maps. They talked about the quiet first, how complete it was, how different it felt from other places. They mentioned staying for a few nights, then corrected themselves in a follow-up reply, changing it to longer than planned. That small edit stuck with me. Someone in the comments asked for coordinates. The original poster never replied. Another user pressed them, saying they were planning a similar trip and wanted to know if the site was still accessible. This time, the reply came quickly. If you're looking for exact directions, this probably isn't the place for you. It wasn't hostile, just firm. I scrolled past it, then stopped, my finger hovering. Below that, buried between arguments about leave no trace ethics and gear recommendations, was a comment that felt different from the rest. It was short, only 2 sentences. People go there because they want to be alone. Just make sure you actually leave when you say you will. That was it. No context, no explanation, no follow-up. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Read it again. Then again. It wasn't scary. Not really. If anything, It sounded practical, sensible advice, the kind of thing you'd say to someone heading into a remote area. But there was something about the phrasing that made my skin tighten slightly, like I'd missed a joke everyone else understood. When you say you will. I checked the username. It was inactive. No profile picture. No other posts. I told myself I was overthinking it. I always overthought things late at night. That was nothing new. Still, I opened a new tab and started cross-referencing what little information I had. Maps, satellite views, old Forest Service documents. I didn't find the site. Not exactly. But I found areas that matched the descriptions. Overgrown access roads. Clearings that looked too symmetrical to be entirely natural. Patches of land that didn't have recent photos, as if they'd been skipped over. Each click made the idea feel more solid, less like a fantasy, more like a plan. I checked the clock in the corner of my screen. 1:47 a.m., the refrigerator hummed. The neon light outside shifted from blue to red and back again, washing the far wall in color. I realized I was leaning forward, elbows on my knees, like I was listening to someone tell me a secret. That should have been another warning. At some point, I grabbed my phone and texted my brother. He was the only person I felt obligated to tell. Not because I thought something would happen, but because it felt irresponsible not to. A rule drilled into me years ago. Someone should always know where you're going. I kept it vague. Thinking about heading out to camp for a few days, I typed, somewhere out west. No service. I'll check in when I'm back. The dots appeared almost immediately. Where exactly? I hesitated, staring at the screen. I didn't have a good answer. Not yet. And a strange part of me didn't want to explain it. Didn't want to turn it into something concrete by naming it. Not sure yet, I wrote back. Still planning. There was a pause this time. Longer. Just be careful, he replied. And don't disappear on me. I almost laughed. It felt like an overreaction, like he was projecting his own worries onto me. I typed back a reassurance, something casual, and tossed the phone onto the couch. The moment it left my hand, a wave of unease rolled through me. Not fear, exactly, but something colder. The sense that I'd just closed a door without fully understanding what was on the other side. I looked back at my laptop, at the forum thread, at that single comment sitting there, unchanged, waiting. Just make sure you actually leave when you say you will. I shut the tab, not because I was scared, because for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, I didn't want to read anything else that might make the decision feel less like my own. I left just after sunrise, the sky still pale and unfinished, like it hadn't fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The city was quiet in that specific way it only gets early on a weekday. Too awake to feel peaceful, too empty to feel alive. I loaded the last of my gear into the trunk, closed the apartment door behind me, and didn't look back. That felt important at the time, like a clean break, even though it was really just avoidance dressed up as confidence. The first part of the drive was easy, familiar. I merged onto the highway with the radio low, letting a local morning show fill the car with half-hearted jokes and traffic updates that didn't apply to me anymore. The lanes stretched wide and forgiving, concrete barriers sliding past in a steady rhythm. Gas stations, chain restaurants, billboards, advertising things I didn't need. Everything about it felt reassuringly ordinary, predictable. I watched the city thin out mile by mile. Buildings gave way to warehouses. Warehouses to open stretches of land broken up by clusters of trees and the occasional farmhouse. The radio signal stayed strong, then started to crackle, the voices warping slightly whenever I passed through a dip in the road. I turned it off somewhere without really noticing, left with nothing but the hum of the tires and the muted roar of air rushing past the windows. The highway eventually narrowed, funneling traffic onto a county road that felt older, less maintained. The lines were faded, the asphalt patched in places like someone had tried to stitch it back together after too many years of wear. Speed limits dropped, signs grew sparse. I passed a weathered wooden sign warning about deer crossings, its paint bleached almost white by the sun. That was when my phone buzzed for the last time. 1 bar of service, then none. The signal icon disappeared so cleanly it felt deliberate, like someone had flipped a switch. I glanced at it, half expecting it to come back, but it didn't. The screen stayed dark when I locked it, reflecting my face faintly. Eyes tired, jaw set, expression neutral in a way that no longer meant calm. I wasn't worried. I'd planned for this. Downloaded maps, checked routes, printed directions I'd stuffed into the glove compartment like it was the early 2000s again. There was something comforting about that, about not relying entirely on a device that could just stop. The county road twisted and climbed, cutting through denser stretches of forest. Trees pressed closer to the shoulders, their branches arching overhead in places, creating tunnels of shadow that the sunlight barely penetrated. I rolled the window down an inch and let the air in. It smelled different out here. Damp earth, pine, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. After another 15 minutes, the pavement ended without ceremony. One moment I was driving on cracked asphalt. The next, my tires were crunching over gravel and dirt. A small green sign marked the transition, bolted crookedly to a post. Forest Service Road. No number, no arrows, just the words, slightly rusted, like they'd been there long enough to be forgotten. I slowed instinctively, gripping the wheel a little tighter as the car jostled beneath me. The road narrowed again, forcing me to pay attention to every curve, every dip. Potholes appeared without warning, some shallow, others deep enough to rattle my teeth if I hit them wrong. Branches brushed against the sides of the car with soft, dragging sounds, leaving thin scratches in the dust coating the paint. I checked my GPS. The map hesitated, the little blue dot stuttering like it was unsure of itself. Then the screen flashed, recalculated, and tried to reroute me back the way I'd come. I ignored it. I knew this part wasn't going to show up properly. That had been mentioned more than once in the forum threads. Service roads didn't always make it into the system. The land out here changed too often. Washouts, overgrowth, roads that were technically still there but no longer meant for regular use. Still, the rerouting felt persistent. Every time I passed a fork or a bend, the GPS would buzz softly, suggesting impossible turns, insisting I make a U-turn on stretches barely wide enough for one vehicle. Eventually, I muted it. The silence that followed felt heavier than I expected. No radio, no notifications. Just the low growl of the engine and the constant percussion of gravel under the tires. I became acutely aware of how alone I was, how far I'd already come without seeing another car. That's when I noticed the marker. It was on the right side of the road, just past a shallow curve. A small reflective square, no bigger than my palm, nailed to a tree at about eye level. It caught the sunlight as I passed, flashing briefly like a distant camera lens. I slowed down, glancing at it in the rearview mirror. It didn't look official. No numbers, no insignia, just a plain reflective surface. The kind you'd find on a cheap safety vest or the back of a road sign, cut down to size. The edges were uneven, like it had been trimmed by hand rather than stamped out in a factory. At the time, I shrugged it off. Hunters marked trails like that sometimes. So did surveyors, or people who wanted to find their way back to a specific spot without relying on memory. It made sense. Sort of. I told myself it was just another sign that humans had been here before me, that I wasn't venturing into some untouched wilderness like the stories liked to pretend. The road continued, winding deeper, darker. The canopy overhead thickened, filtering the light until everything took on a greenish tint, like I was driving underwater. My sense of direction started to blur. Left turns felt like right turns. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to tell how long I'd been driving since the pavement ended. Eventually, the road narrowed to the point where I could see branches closing in ahead, and beyond that, a small clearing opening up between the trees. I pulled over and shut the engine off. The sudden absence of sound hit me harder than I expected. The ticking of cooling metal echoed in the stillness, sharp and deliberate. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, listening, letting my eyes adjust to the filtered light. This was it, or close enough. I stepped out of the car and stretched, gravel crunching loudly beneath my boots. The air felt cooler here, heavier. The forest loomed on all sides, dense and watchful, but still quiet. Normal quiet, the kind I'd come looking for. I didn't think about the marker again. Not then. It wasn't until days later, driving back the same way with my nerves stretched thin and my hands shaking on the wheel, that I realized something was wrong. I passed the spot where it should have been, where I was certain I'd seen it. The tree was there, same curve, same patch of dirt at its base, but the reflective square was gone. No nail holes, no scar on the bark, nothing to suggest it had ever been there at all. At the time, I told myself I must have imagined it. Now, I'm not so sure. I remember thinking, at first, that I'd overshot it. The road narrowed until it was barely more than 2 worn tracks pressed into the dirt. Grass pushing up aggressively between them, like the land was trying to reclaim what little access humans had taken. The trees closed in tighter here, trunks packed close together, their branches knitting overhead into a canopy that filtered the light into something dim and green. It felt like driving through a tunnel that had been growing for decades without supervision. Then, almost abruptly, the forest opened. I eased off the accelerator as the trees fell back on either side, revealing a small clearing tucked away like it had been deliberately hidden. Not large, just enough space for a vehicle to pull in and a tent or two to be set up comfortably. But it was distinct, defined. The ground dipped slightly in the center, as if water had once pooled there before finding another path, and the surrounding tree line formed a rough oval, natural but oddly contained. I rolled to a stop and shut the engine off. The silence was immediate and complete. Not the soft, living quiet you get in most wooded areas, the kind filled with distant birds or the constant hiss of insects, but a stillness so clean it felt engineered. The ticking of the engine as it cooled sounded unnaturally loud, sharp little clicks echoing off trunks and branches before dissolving into nothing. When that stopped, there was nothing left to replace it. No wind in the leaves, no buzzing, no distant water, just absence. I stayed seated longer than I needed to, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening, waiting for something, anything, to fill the gap. My ears rang faintly, the way they do when a room goes suddenly quiet, and for a moment I wondered if the silence itself was the sound I was supposed to hear. Eventually, I opened the door. The hinges creaked louder than they should have, the noise slicing through the clearing in a way that made me instinctively pause, one foot still inside the car. The sound didn't echo. It didn't bounce. It just stopped, like it had been absorbed by the trees. Gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, the noise startling in its own way. I stood there, shoulders slightly tense, scanning the perimeter. The clearing looked untouched. No tire tracks beyond my own, no footprints, no disturbed patches of dirt where someone else had recently set up camp. That alone wasn't unusual. This was exactly what I'd been looking for after all. Somewhere out of the way, somewhere forgotten. But as I walked farther in, taking slow, deliberate steps, small details began to register. There were no fire rings. I didn't just mean there wasn't an active one. There were no stones arranged in a circle, no blackened earth, no half-buried cans or bottle caps someone hadn't bothered to pack out. No charred logs pushed aside and left to rot. Nothing. The ground was clean, covered in a thin layer of needles and leaves that looked undisturbed, like they'd been settling naturally for years. I crouched and brushed a patch aside with my glove, expecting to find something underneath. Ash. Scorch marks. Anything. Just dirt. I straightened up slowly, my eyes tracing the edges of the clearing again. The trees were close enough that setting up more than one tent would have been uncomfortable, but not impossible. It was the kind of spot people would use once, maybe twice, and then move on. The kind that should have had traces of that use lingering in small, forgettable ways. But there was nothing. No trash either. No bits of plastic caught in low branches. No torn food wrappers. Not even something biodegradable. No apple cores, no paper towels decomposing into the soil. It was as if anyone who'd ever been here had been meticulous to a degree that bordered on obsession, or as if no one had been here at all. That thought should have been reassuring. Instead, it made my skin prickle faintly along my arms. I walked the perimeter, counting my steps without meaning to. The clearing wasn't perfectly symmetrical, but it felt intentional, like it had settled into this shape because something wanted it that way. The trees at the edges leaned inward slightly, their branches forming loose, uneven arches that framed the space without fully closing it off. I kept expecting to notice a detail that would break the spell. A soda can half buried near a root, a scrap of tape on a tree, something to remind me that this was just another spot on a long list of places people had passed through. Nothing did. I set my pack down near the center and stood still, listening again. The silence held. It wasn't oppressive, not yet. It just felt complete, like the clearing was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I told myself that was nonsense. The kind of thought you get when you've been alone too long and your brain starts looking for patterns where none exist. Still, I found myself lowering my voice when I muttered, "Okay," under my breath. I took a few more steps, scanning the ground carefully now. No flattened grass, no depressions where a tent had been pitched recently. Even the soil felt firm, unmarked by stakes or repeated foot traffic. The only signs of life were the trees themselves and a few hardy plants pushing through the needles at the edges. I glanced back toward the road. From here it was barely visible, just a thin break in the trees already starting to blend back into the forest. Once I set up camp, once the car was fully unloaded, it would be easy to forget exactly where I'd come in. The thought sent a brief, sharp flicker of unease through me, quickly smothered by reason. I had maps. I had time. I wasn't lost. To ground myself, I started unpacking. Slow movements, familiar motions. I laid my tent out flat, smoothing the fabric with my hands, checking the seams, counting the stakes. The small, repetitive actions helped, anchoring me in something tangible. The nylon whispered softly as it shifted, the sound unnaturally loud in the still air. Halfway through, I stopped. I had the strange impression, brief but undeniable, that the clearing felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. Not by much, just enough to notice. Like the tree line had crept inward while I wasn't looking. I turned in a slow circle, scanning for anything that might explain the sensation. Everything looked the same. The trees stood where they had before. The shadows hadn't noticeably changed. The light filtering through the canopy was steady, muted, consistent. If anything, the clearing looked exactly as it had when I arrived. I exhaled a little more sharply than necessary and shook my head. Lack of sleep, that was all. Too many late nights, too much caffeine, too much time spent staring at screens and reading half-creepy forum posts. This was supposed to be the calm part. I reminded myself of that as I finished unloading the car, as I stood there with my gear neatly arranged at my feet, as I took one last look around and nodded to myself, like I was confirming a choice I'd already made. At the time, the only thing that bothered me was how pristine the place felt, how untouched. It didn't occur to me yet that the real problem wasn't that nothing had been left behind. It was that it felt like nothing had ever been allowed to stay. I should have started setting up immediately and kept my mind busy. That was the smart thing to do. It's what I'd always done on solo trips. Get the tent up, get a small routine going, give yourself structure so the woods don't start filling in the quiet spaces in your head. But the longer I stood there in that too clean clearing, the more I felt pulled toward the edges, toward the tree line. Like there was something just out of sight that my brain kept trying to confirm. I told myself I was just being thorough, making sure there weren't hazards, checking for dead limbs overhead, animal trails, signs of recent activity, the usual, practical. So I walked. The needles under my boots muffled my steps, soft enough that it felt like I was moving through a place that didn't want to be disturbed. I stayed close to the perimeter at first, letting my eyes follow the ground, scanning for anything that looked unnatural. The clearing's center was empty, but along the edges, the terrain started to get uneven. Roots rising like knuckles, fallen branches half buried beneath leaf litter. Every few feet, I'd pause and listen, expecting the forest to come back to life. Birds, insects, wind, anything to confirm that the silence wasn't something I'd imagined. It didn't. The deeper I looked, the more I realized the cleanliness wasn't just limited to the open space. There were no bottle caps tucked near roots, no scraps of plastic, no paper labels faded by sun and rain. Even the kind of trash people don't think about. Zip ties, fishing line, the little corners of foil from food packaging, none of it. It was like the clearing had been curated. That was the word that came to mind. Curated. I reached the far end, where the tree line thickened and the ground dipped into a shallow depression. It looked like it could have been a seasonal creek bed at one point. The earth slightly darker there, the plants a little denser. The air felt cooler, heavier. I stood still, and for the first time since arriving, I caught a faint movement of wind through the upper branches. It was subtle, just a soft shiver of needles high above, but it was enough to make my skin relax a fraction. Then I smelled something. It wasn't strong, not at first. It came in like a memory you can't place. something sour and damp, edged with a faint metallic note that made my nose wrinkle. It wasn't the clean, sharp smell of pine or wet dirt. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to the open air. I paused, breathing shallowly, trying to locate the source. The smell faded when I stood still, then returned when I moved, as if I'd stepped into a thin pocket of it that shifted with the air. I took a few slow steps toward the trees, following it the way you follow smoke. The ground became softer underfoot, leaf litter deeper, the light dimmer as the canopy thickened. And that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just debris, an old tarp, maybe, collapsed and half swallowed by the forest floor. The color was muted, olive green, blending into the shadows. But the shape was wrong, too straight in places, too structured to be natural. I moved closer. It wasn't a tarp. It was part of a tent frame, old aluminum poles, bent and snapped in a few sections, still connected by shock cord that had gone slack with age. The poles lay in a rough oval, partially buried under needles and leaves, like someone had tried to set it up and then simply left. A few scraps of fabric were tangled around it, shredded and stiff, with frayed seams that looked like they'd been chewed or torn by weather. There was no complete tent, just the skeleton of one. I crouched down, careful, and brushed aside a layer of needles with my glove. The metal was dull, oxidized, flecked with spots where moisture had eaten into it. It didn't look like something left last weekend. It looked like it had been there a long time. But if it had been there a long time, why did the clearing look untouched? I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to reconcile the contradiction. The clearing itself had no signs of human use, yet here, just beyond the edge, was proof that someone had been here. Someone who'd brought gear, who'd tried to camp, who'd left something behind. And then the smell hit me more clearly. It wasn't the rot of leaves. It wasn't the musk of animal bedding. It was something stale and wet, like fabric left in a basement too long. Underneath that was something else, faint, sour, and unpleasantly sweet, like spoiled meat wrapped in damp cloth. Not enough to make me gag, but enough to tighten my throat. I leaned back instinctively and took a breath through my mouth. My eyes flicked around the area, searching for the obvious explanation. A dead animal nearby, a carcass hidden under brush, something natural that would explain it. But I didn't see anything. No flies, no scavenger activity, no disturbed ground, just the tent frame. I stood slowly, the way you do when you don't want to make sudden movements for reasons you can't fully explain. My pulse had sped up, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it in my throat. I told myself to calm down. It was nothing. Someone's old gear, a forgotten piece. The smell could be mold, mildew, whatever. Forests were full of unpleasant smells if you looked hard enough. Still, I didn't touch the frame again. Instead, my eyes traveled upward, following the line of one bent pole toward a tree trunk. And that's when I noticed the rope. It was wrapped around the tree about chest height, thick enough to be noticeable but weathered to the same dull color as the bark. At first glance, it looked like an old line someone used to hang a bear bag or tie off a tarp. The knot was simple, practical, but the rope didn't lead anywhere. It wasn't attached to another tree. It wasn't holding anything up. It wasn't connected to a hook or a pulley. It was just there, wrapped tightly, ends cut clean, hanging down a few inches like someone had tied it for a purpose and then changed their mind. I stepped closer and examined it without touching. The fibers were frayed, darkened in places, stiff with age. There was a faint sheen on part of it, like it had been rubbed repeatedly. The smell seemed stronger here, clinging to the air around the trunk. My first thought was that it was nothing. My second thought was that it was something people didn't want to see. I didn't let myself follow that thought any further. Instead, I did what I always did when something unsettled me. I looked for a logical task to focus on. I told myself I'd come back later in daylight and take a closer look if I still felt curious. I told myself it was smart not to mess with abandoned gear in the backcountry. You never knew what stories were attached to it. You never knew if someone might come back. I turned away and walked back toward the center of the clearing. The air felt slightly warmer there, less heavy. The silence still held, but it didn't feel as close to my skin. I set my pack down and began assembling my own tent poles with deliberate care, as if careful movements could keep the unease from growing. And yet, even while I worked, I kept glancing toward the tree line. Because I could still smell it, faintly, on the edge of the breeze. Not enough to pinpoint, not enough to prove anything. Just enough to stay in the back of my throat like a bad aftertaste. I didn't investigate further that day. I told myself I'd made the responsible choice, that curiosity didn't belong in places like this. I believed it too for a while. But later, lying awake in the dark with the nylon walls of my tent inches from my face, I would realize something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Whatever that rope had been for, it hadn't been tied there by accident. By the time I finished setting up my tent, the light had already begun to change. It wasn't dusk yet, not fully, but the brightness of the clearing had dulled, like someone had turned the saturation down a notch. Shadows stretched longer across the ground, slipping between tree roots and pooling in shallow depressions where the earth dipped. The air felt cooler now, carrying that unmistakable evening chill that settles in once the sun starts losing ground. I moved through the rest of my setup on autopilot. Tent stakes went in cleanly, the soil firm but forgiving, poles snapped into place with familiar tension, the fabric pulling tight and smooth the way it should. I checked the zippers twice, clipped the inner hooks, adjusted the rain fly even though the forecast had been clear. Small habits, comforting habits, the kind you don't think about until you need them. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at my work. The tent sat near the center of the clearing, just offset enough to keep me away from the tree line without feeling exposed. It looked right. Ordinary. Reassuringly out of place in a way that made me feel like I was reclaiming the space, even if only temporarily. I told myself that mattered. I set up my small camp stove on a flat rock a few feet away and pulled out one of the freeze-dried meals I'd brought along, beef stew, according to the label. I tore it open, poured in the water from my bottle, and stirred slowly with the plastic spoon, watching the steam curl upward and disappear into the thinning light. The smell was bland and familiar. Salt, preservatives, something vaguely meaty. Not unpleasant, just unremarkable. It grounded me in a way the clearing hadn't yet. I sat on a folded pad and ate straight from the pouch, listening to the soft scrape of spoon against foil. Each sound felt amplified, echoing slightly before vanishing. The forest around me began to shift. At first, it was subtle. A faint sigh as wind moved through the upper branches, needles brushing against each other high above. It didn't reach the ground, not really. Down where I sat, the air was still, cool against my skin. The smell from earlier, the sour, damp note I'd noticed near the tree line, seemed to thin out as the temperature dropped, replaced by the cleaner scent of pine and soil. I finished eating and sealed the empty pouch, slipping it into my bear canister with the rest of my food. Another routine, another small layer of control. As I worked, a strange thought surfaced, uninvited. I realized I missed the noise of my apartment, the refrigerator hum, the low, constant buzz that filled the space when everything else went quiet. The uneven whine of my laptop fan, struggling through another late-night workload. Even the distant sounds of traffic, muffled by walls and glass. I'd spent so long trying to escape those noises that I hadn't considered what would replace them. Out here, there was nothing steady, no background hum, no mechanical rhythm to anchor time. Just silence, broken occasionally by wind that came and went without warning. I zipped myself into a light jacket and stood, stretching my arms overhead. The sky above the clearing had darkened to a deepening blue, streaked faintly with clouds that caught the last traces of daylight. I didn't bother starting a fire. There was no ring, and I didn't feel like improvising one after what I'd noticed earlier. Besides, I didn't need the warmth. Not yet. I did one last slow circuit of the clearing, more out of habit than concern. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. The tent frame and rope at the edge of the tree line stayed out of sight, tucked away just far enough that I could pretend they weren't there if I didn't think about them too hard. Satisfied, or as close to it as I was going to get, I stepped back toward my tent. Halfway there, I stopped. Not because I'd heard something, because I hadn't. The wind had died. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden drop, no sharp contrast. Just the quiet realization that the soft movement in the trees had faded out completely. The branches above stilled, needles frozen mid-sway. The clearing felt sealed again, like it had earlier, but tighter now. More focused. I stood there, listening. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost dismissed it as my own movement echoing back to me. A soft scrape, then another, slow, deliberate. Not rhythmic enough to be wind, not heavy enough to be something large crashing through brush. It sounded like something brushing lightly against bark. I took a step forward. The sound stopped. I frowned, holding still, my boot suspended just above the ground. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears, each inhale and exhale a careful negotiation. I waited, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. After a few seconds, I shifted my weight. Scrape, I froze again. The sound cut off instantly, like it had been waiting for me to move. My skin prickled, a thin wave of awareness crawling up the back of my neck. I scanned the tree line, eyes adjusting to the dim light, searching for movement, for a shape that didn't belong. I didn't see anything. I stayed where I was for a full minute, barely daring to blink. The silence pressed in, thick enough that my ears rang faintly. My heart thudded once, hard, then settled into a slower, heavier rhythm. Carefully, I bent down and picked up a small rock from the ground. I tossed it toward the edge of the clearing. It hit the dirt with a dull thud and rolled to a stop. Nothing happened. No sound, no movement, no reaction. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and shook my head, annoyed with myself. Animals made noises. The forest wasn't a controlled environment. Of course, things would sound different at night. Of course, silence would come and go. I walked the rest of the way to my tent without incident, unzipped the flap, and climbed inside. The nylon walls closed around me, thin but familiar. I laid my gear out within arm's reach, slipped into my sleeping bag, and turned off my headlamp. The darkness settled instantly. Lying there, I listened to the fabric rustle softly with my movements. I focused on that sound, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, trying to recreate the kind of background noise I was used to falling asleep to. But every time I shifted, every time the sleeping bag crinkled or the tent creaked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was triggering something outside, like the clearing was listening, like whatever had made that sound before was still there, perfectly still, waiting for me to move again. I woke up all at once. There was no dream pulling me out of sleep, no half-formed images dissolving as my eyes opened. One moment there was nothing, no awareness, no transition, and the next I was fully conscious, staring into the dark with my heart already beating faster than it should have been. It felt less like waking up and more like being switched on. I lay still, listening, my body tense in a way that told me this wasn't a false alarm. I wasn't groggy, I wasn't confused. My mind was clear, sharp, alert in a way it never was when I woke up naturally. The kind of alertness you get right before something bad happens, when your body reacts faster than your thoughts can catch up. The tent was completely dark. No moonlight filtered through the fabric. No glow from a headlamp or phone. Just the faint outline of the mesh ceiling above me and the soft, irregular shadows cast by trees I couldn't see. The air inside the tent felt colder than it had earlier, pressing against my face every time I breathed in. I checked my watch by feel, then stopped myself. I didn't want to turn on a light yet. Something about the darkness felt important, like breaking it too soon would give something away. I focused instead on what I could hear. At first, there was nothing obvious. No wind moving through the trees, no insects chirping, no distant animal calls. The clearing had gone quiet again. That same sealed, unnatural stillness I'd noticed earlier. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty so much as occupied. I listened harder. My ears strained, picking up on smaller details. The faint rustle of my sleeping bag when I shifted my toes. The soft creak of the tent poles adjusting to the night air. My own breathing, slow and deliberate now. Each inhale measured, each exhale controlled. That was it. No other sounds layered in. No background noise to blur the edges. I tried to remember what had woken me. There was no lingering echo of a noise in my head. No sensation of being startled awake by something external. Just the certainty that I hadn't woken up on my own. That something had changed in the space around me, and my body had noticed before my brain could assign a reason. I lay there, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Time stretched, elastic and uncertain, without the usual cues, traffic, HVAC, the distant hum of the city. I had no sense of how long I'd been awake. It could have been seconds. It could have been minutes. Gradually, another sensation crept in. Awareness of distance. The thinness of the tent walls became impossible to ignore. The fabric was close enough that if I extended my arm, my fingers would brush it. Just a layer of nylon and mesh separating me from the clearing outside, from the trees, from whatever else might be standing just beyond the reach of my headlamp's beam. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I told myself this was normal. People woke up in unfamiliar environments all the time. The brain stayed half alert when you slept somewhere new. It was a survival thing, a leftover instinct that kicked in when you weren't in your own bed. That explanation should have comforted me. It didn't. Because even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't woken up alone. Not that someone was inside the tent. Not yet. But that my consciousness had risen in response to something else becoming aware at the same time. Like two switches had been flipped in parallel, miles apart but connected. I held my breath, listening again. That's when I realized something else was wrong. The forest still hadn't come back. No insects, no night birds, no distant rustling. It was as if the entire area had been muted, like someone had turned the volume knob all the way down. The kind of quiet that made even the smallest sound feel dangerous, because it would stand out too clearly. I shifted slightly, careful, testing the space. The sleeping bag crinkled softly. The sound seemed too loud. I froze, every muscle locking in place. My heart hammered once, hard enough that I worried it might actually make noise. I waited for a response, some acknowledgement that the sound had been noticed. Nothing happened. Seconds passed, then more. I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders drop a fraction. The tension didn't leave, but it loosened just enough for me to think again. I reached for my phone, fingers moving cautiously along the ground until they found the familiar shape. I stopped with my thumb resting on the screen. The urge to check the time, to create a small pocket of light and certainty, was almost overwhelming. But another instinct overrode it, stronger and harder to ignore. A warning without words. Don't. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly. Waking something up, drawing attention, confirming my presence. But the idea of lighting up the inside of the tent suddenly felt like a terrible mistake, like raising a flag in the dark. So I left the phone where it was and pulled my hand back slowly. I tried to think about mundane things. My apartment, the couch I'd fallen asleep on so many nights with the TV still on, the refrigerator's steady hum, the laptop fan's uneven whine, the city noises I'd spent so long wanting to escape. I would have given anything for them then. Instead, all I had was the sound of my own body occupying space in a place that felt increasingly aware of me. A faint ache settled between my shoulders, the familiar burn of tension from holding still too long. I shifted again, just a fraction of an inch. The fabric whispered. Somewhere outside the tent, very close to the tree line, something responded. Not loudly, not abruptly, just a soft, almost cautious sound, like a light brush against bark. So subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening so carefully. I went completely still. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt different now. Charged, intentional. My pulse thudded in my ears as understanding crept in, slow and unwelcome. Whatever was out there hadn't made noise randomly. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been an animal moving without awareness. It had reacted. I lay there in the dark, heart racing, the realization settling heavily in my chest. Something outside was paying attention to me, and it knew when I moved. I stayed still long after the sound stopped, my body locked in a position that was already starting to ache. Every instinct told me not to move, not to test the silence again. I had the unsettling sense that whatever was out there didn't need me to do anything dramatic to confirm I was awake. It already knew. Time lost its shape. Without a clock or a screen, minutes felt like they could stretch into hours, each second dragging behind it like a weight. I focused on keeping my breathing shallow, slow enough that the fabric of the sleeping bag barely shifted against my chest. The darkness pressed close, thick and complete, as if the tent had shrunk around me. That was when the whispers began. At first, I thought it was my imagination filling in the gaps, a trick of the ears, the way silence can morph into phantom sounds if you listen too hard. The noise was faint, so faint it barely registered as sound at all. More like the idea of sound, a breath where there shouldn't have been one. I held still and listened. The whisper came again, clearer this time, sliding along the edge of my hearing. It wasn't a word. There was no structure to it that my brain could grab onto. No consonants, no vowels I recognized. Just a soft, shifting murmur, like air being pushed through a narrow space. Then it stopped. I waited, counting my breaths again, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing, that I'd imagined it because I was already on edge. But the moment I allowed myself that thought, another whisper answered from a slightly different direction. Closer. My pulse kicked up, sharp and immediate. I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips. I pressed my lips together, suddenly aware of how loud even a swallow might be in that quiet. The whispers weren't overlapping. They weren't chaotic. They came one at a time, spaced just far enough apart that each one felt deliberate, like something was testing the air, seeing how far it could go without being noticed. I strained to listen more closely, to see if I could pick out meaning. The human brain is desperate for patterns. It will try to make language out of static if you let it. I told myself that if I could just understand what I was hearing, it would stop feeling so threatening. But there was nothing to understand. The sounds didn't form words. They didn't repeat in a recognizable way. They rose and fell, lengthened and shortened, but never in the same pattern twice. They weren't random, though. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. Random noise has a messiness to it, a lack of intention. This felt controlled, measured. Another whisper drifted through the clearing, this one so close to the tent wall that I imagined I could feel it through the fabric, a faint disturbance in the air. It slid along the perimeter, then faded, as if whoever or whatever had leaned in just enough to listen. I didn't move. The silence that followed was heavier now, weighted by the knowledge that it could break at any moment. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before, as if lying still wasn't hiding me so much as displaying me. The tent no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a marker. The next whisper came from the opposite side. My heart lurched, not because it was louder, but because it confirmed something I'd been trying not to think about. They were moving, not pacing, not circling in a predictable loop. The whispers shifted position subtly, as if whoever was making them was adjusting, repositioning, testing different vantage points around the clearing. Each sound was just far enough apart that I couldn't track them easily, couldn't pinpoint a single source. I imagined shapes just beyond the tree line, slipping between trunks without disturbing branches, bare feet on soil, careful steps that left no obvious trace. The image came unbidden, vivid and unwelcome. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay grounded in what I actually knew. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen movement. All I had were whispers, ambiguous, insubstantial, and yet my body reacted as if the threat were undeniable. A bead of sweat traced a slow line down my temple despite the cold. My fingers curled into the sleeping bag, nails pressing into the fabric. I thought about my gear, laid out within reach, the knife in my pack, the headlamp, the phone. All of it felt suddenly inadequate, like props in a play where the real danger existed just out of view. The whispers returned, 2 of them this time, separated by a pause so brief it made my chest tighten. They weren't responding to each other. They weren't communicating in a way I could recognize. There was no call and answer, no exchange. It felt more like overlapping awareness, multiple points of attention focused on the same place. On me. I tried to slow my breathing again, terrified that the faint rise and fall of my chest was somehow visible through the tent wall. The fabric seemed thinner than ever, each breath threatening to betray me. I wondered if the whispers could hear my heart. if they could sense the way my pulse jumped whenever the sound shifted closer. Another whisper slid past, this one lower, closer to the ground. I pictured someone crouching just outside the tent, their head tilted, listening. The thought made my stomach clench violently, and I had to fight the urge to jerk upright, to shout, to do anything that would shatter the careful stillness. Instead, I lay there rigid, letting the sounds wash over me. They didn't escalate. Not immediately. There was no sudden rush of movement, no grasping hands, no zipper being pulled. Just the slow, deliberate repositioning of those soft, formless sounds. Each one felt like a question posed directly to my body, waiting for an answer I was too afraid to give. At some point, I realized something else that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The whispers weren't coming from the trees anymore. They were inside the clearing, not all at once, not obviously, but close enough now that the space between them and the tent felt uncomfortably small. The air itself seemed disturbed, as if someone were breathing just out of sync with me. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and swallowed hard, the sound thunderous in my own ears. I waited for a reaction. None came. The whispers paused again, retreating into silence so complete it felt artificial. My ears rang faintly, the way they do after a loud noise, even though nothing loud had happened. I lay there, muscles trembling with the effort of staying still, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Then, just as I began to wonder if it was over, a whisper brushed past the tent wall once more, closer than any before. It wasn't louder. It didn't need to be. It was enough to let me know that whatever was out there understood the space I occupied, understood the thin barrier between us, and understood exactly how far it could go without forcing me to react. That was when it fully sank in. These weren't random noises in the woods. They were controlled, and they were patient. The first touch was so light I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. I was lying on my side, facing the tent wall, my eyes fixed on a patch of darkness that looked no different from any other. The whispers had faded again, leaving behind that same strained quiet, and for a few seconds, just a few, I wondered if whatever had been outside had finally moved on. My muscles were still locked, my jaw aching from how tightly I'd clenched it, but the absence of sound felt like a small mercy. Then the zipper shifted. Not the scrape you hear when someone pulls it quickly, not even a cautious tug, just the faintest metallic click, like two teeth brushing against each other by accident. The sound was so precise, so restrained, that it sent a jolt straight through my chest. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I barely breathed. I stared at the zipper line, my mind racing ahead of what my body could process. If someone was there, if someone had their hand on it, I would hear more. Fabric pulling, the rasp of metal, the zipper slider moving against resistance. None of that happened. Instead, there was another small sound, softer this time. A whisper of contact against nylon. Not the wind, not an animal brushing past. It was too localized, too intentional. The fabric pressed inward slightly, just enough to break the flat plane of the tent wall. My heart slammed once, hard enough that it knocked the breath from my lungs. I swallowed the sound it wanted to make and focused on staying still. The tent wall bowed again, this time more deliberately, and I felt a shape behind it. Narrow, articulated, fingertips. They pressed lightly against the nylon, not pushing through, not clawing, just resting there, testing the material. I could see the faint outline where the fabric stretched around them, 5 small points arranged in a way that made my stomach drop. The touch moved, slowly. The fingertips traced a short path along the wall, following the seam, then stopped. The pressure never increased. Whoever it was didn't seem interested in forcing their way in. They were exploring the boundary, learning its limits. I couldn't stop my body from reacting. My breathing hitched, a sharp intake that sounded deafening in the stillness. The fingertips paused immediately. Everything froze. The silence that followed was absolute. No whispers, no movement. Not even the faint ambient sounds I'd half expected the forest to produce by now. It was like the world had been placed on mute. My pulse roared in my ears. I was acutely aware of every inch of my body, the tension in my legs, the sweat cooling on my skin, the way my hands trembled where they gripped the sleeping bag. I waited, bracing for the next move. Nothing happened. Seconds passed, then more. The fingertips didn't return, but the sense of presence didn't fade. If anything, it intensified, pressing in from all sides. I had the overwhelming impression that whatever was outside the tent was waiting, listening, measuring my response. A thought cut through the panic, sharp and insistent. I had to do something. Staying silent hadn't made it go away. Staying still hadn't either. Every instinct I had from years of camping, from all the warnings and stories and half-remembered advice, screamed the same thing. Let it know you're awake. Let it know you're not an easy target. My throat felt tight as I drew in a breath. "Hey," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. The word hung in the air, small and fragile. "I know you're there." I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just spoke, loud enough to carry beyond the tent wall, to pierce the quiet I'd been hiding in. The sound of my own voice startled me more than I'd like to admit. It felt out of place, intrusive, like I'd broken a rule I didn't fully understand. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the silence dropped. Not gradually, not like sound fading out. It collapsed, all at once, into something so complete it felt engineered. The air itself seemed to lock in place. My ears rang faintly, as if reacting to a loud noise that hadn't actually occurred. No whispers, no movement, no breath. It was as though the clearing had been emptied in an instant. I waited, my heart hammering, half expecting the next sound to be violent, to be the zipper tearing open, the fabric ripping, hands forcing their way inside. I tensed for impact that never came. Instead, the quiet stretched on, thick and unnatural. I whispered again, my voice barely audible this time. "I'm armed." That was a lie. I didn't have a gun. I had a knife buried somewhere in my pack, but saying the word felt necessary, protective. The silence didn't react. Minutes passed, long enough that the immediate surge of adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The absence of response was worse than any noise. It felt calculated, controlled, as if my words had been noted, filed away, and deemed unworthy of acknowledgement. I lay there, eyes burning, every sense tuned outward, waiting for the world to resume. Eventually, something did change, but not in the way I expected. The feeling of being watched lessened, just slightly. Not gone, just withdrawn, like attention shifting elsewhere, temporarily. The kind of pause that implies continuation later. I didn't move for a long time after that. I didn't sleep, not really. I stayed curled on my side, listening to the nothingness, afraid that the smallest motion would bring the fingertips back. And in that drawn-out, suffocating quiet, one thought lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. Whatever had touched my tent wasn't surprised when I spoke. It had been expecting me to. Morning came without ceremony. There was no gradual brightening, no bird song easing me out of the night. I became aware of the light all at once, a dull gray pressing through the tent fabric, and with it, the deep, aching realization that I hadn't really slept at all. My body felt heavy, stiff from holding itself too tightly for too long, every muscle sore in a way that suggested prolonged vigilance rather than rest. For a moment, I stayed where I was, staring at the inside of the tent, listening. The silence was different now, less sealed, less intentional. I could hear faint movement in the trees again, the soft tick of branches shifting, the distant rustle of needles. Normal forest sounds, tentative but present. That alone sent a confusing wave of relief through me, quickly followed by unease. It felt wrong that everything sounded ordinary again after the night I'd just endured. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 6:18 a.m. I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep at some point, but it hadn't felt like rest. My thoughts were slow, fogged by exhaustion, yet the memory of the night sat sharp and intact in my mind. The zipper, the pressure on the fabric, the way the silence had collapsed when I spoke. None of it felt distant or dreamlike. If anything, it felt closer in daylight, stripped of the darkness that might have allowed me to dismiss it. I took a deep breath and unzipped the tent. Cold air rushed in, clean and damp, carrying the smell of earth and pine. I pushed the flap open and paused, half expecting something to be waiting just outside, someone standing too close, watching. The clearing, however, looked empty at first glance. The light revealed the same quiet oval of ground I'd seen the day before, softened now by morning shadows. I stepped out slowly, boots sinking slightly into the soil. That was when I saw them. The footprints formed a loose circle around my tent, evenly spaced, each one pressed clearly into the dirt as if the ground had been prepared to receive them. They weren't scattered or accidental. They were placed, deliberate. I stopped moving entirely, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were taking in. Bare footprints, no tread marks, no impressions from shoes or boots, just the unmistakable shape of human feet. Heels, arches, toes, pressed deep enough that the edges were crisp, undisturbed by wind or debris. They were close, closer than I would have liked, marking a boundary around my tent at a distance that felt intimate rather than cautious. I took a careful step forward, then another, following the curve of the circle with my eyes. They weren't all the same size. Some prints were long and narrow, toes splayed slightly, as if the person had been standing still for a while. Others were shorter, broader, the heel deeper, the toes dug in unevenly. A few overlapped faintly, but not in a chaotic way. More like adjustments, small shifts in stance rather than movement through the space. No attempt had been made to hide them. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. Whoever had been here hadn't cared about covering their tracks. They hadn't brushed the dirt smooth or stepped carefully to avoid leaving marks. They had stood where they wanted to stand, for as long as they wanted, and then left them there like a record. I crouched slowly, careful not to disturb anything, and examined one of the prints near the front of the tent. The soil was compacted deeply beneath the heel, the impression clean. Whoever it belonged to hadn't been passing through. They'd been stationary, watching. A shiver ran through me as the implications began to sink in. These weren't footprints left by someone approaching or retreating. There was no trail leading in from the trees, no clear path back out. The marks simply appeared around the tent, forming a rough perimeter as if the people who made them had stepped into place and stayed there. I straightened up and turned slowly, scanning the rest of the clearing. The circle was almost complete. Not perfect. There were small gaps where the ground had been too uneven or covered in roots, but the intention was unmistakable. My tent sat at the center, unavoidably framed by the evidence of the night. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before, as if the daylight had stripped away whatever fragile protection the darkness had offered. In the night, I hadn't known where they were. In the morning, I knew exactly how close they'd been. Too close. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I stopped, my breath catching slightly. I'd reached the point where the prints changed again, where a new size appeared, smaller than the rest, toes clustered closer together. I swallowed hard and continued, forcing myself to finish. There were more than I'd initially thought. Not just 2, not just 3. Enough that the circle felt intentional rather than coincidental. I stood there, the morning air cold against my face, trying to reconcile the image in front of me with the version of the night I'd experienced. The whispers, the movement, the fingertips against the tent wall. It all lined up now in a way that made my chest feel tight. They hadn't been testing the tent alone. They'd been testing me. I glanced back at the tent, at the thin nylon walls that had separated us. From the outside, it looked absurdly fragile. From the inside, it had felt like my entire world. The thought made me nauseous. My mind reached instinctively for explanations. Campers playing a joke, locals trying to scare off outsiders. Some strange coincidence amplified by my lack of sleep. Each excuse fell apart as quickly as it formed. People don't stand barefoot in a circle around a stranger's tent in the middle of the night. They don't stay long enough to leave deep impressions and then vanish without a sound. They don't do it without leaving a single other trace. No trash, no gear, no path in or out. And they don't do it once. As I looked at those footprints, at how settled they seemed, a thought crept in that chilled me more than the night air ever could. This wasn't improvisation. This was routine. I felt it then, a shift in my understanding of the place I was standing in. The clearing hadn't been empty because no one used it. It had been empty because whatever happened here didn't leave the kind of mess people noticed at first glance. I backed away from the circle slowly, careful not to step into any of the prints, as if disturbing them might break some unspoken rule. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder now, urgent. The fear was still there, sharp, immediate. But something else was forming beneath it. Recognition. This had happened before. Not just once. Not just to me. And the worst part wasn't that they'd come so close while I slept. It was that they'd stood there openly, confidently, as if they knew I would see the marks in the morning and understand exactly what they meant. I didn't pack right away. I should have. Any rational person would have seen those bare footprints and started throwing gear into the car without stopping to think. But fear doesn't always make you move. Sometimes it pins you in place, forces you to stare until your brain accepts what your eyes are showing you. I stood there in the center of the clearing for another long moment, listening to the forest wake up around me, trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation that I just hadn't reached yet. The problem was, the clearing didn't feel normal anymore. It felt like a room someone else had been using when I wasn't looking. My gaze kept drifting to the tree line, to the exact stretch of shadowed trunks where I'd smelled that damp, sour note the day before and found the old tent frame and the cut rope. Something in me didn't want to go back there. Something more primitive than logic. But the circle of footprints had already crossed the line from unsettling to impossible to ignore. And once that threshold is crossed, curiosity becomes a kind of compulsion. I needed to know if there was more proof, more context, anything that could make the night fit into a shape I could understand. I grabbed my jacket, stepped carefully around the prints, and moved toward the far end of the clearing. The air near the trees was cooler, shaded, carrying the dampness of soil that never fully dried. As I got closer, the smell returned, faint, stale, like wet fabric that had been folded and forgotten. It wasn't strong enough to make me gag, but it clung to the back of my throat, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. The tent frame was still there, half buried and skeletal, exactly where I'd seen it. The rope was still wrapped around the tree, its ends hanging down like something unfinished. Seeing it in daylight should have made it less ominous. It should have reduced it to what it probably was: abandoned gear, old line, forgotten trash. Instead, it felt worse, because now it was paired with the footprints behind me. Now it wasn't just an object, it was evidence. I moved past it slowly, scanning the nearby trunks, the ground, the low branches. My eyes kept catching on small imperfections in the bark. Scratches, knots, old scars. The forest is full of marks if you look long enough, most of them meaningless. But I wasn't looking for random scratches. I was looking for a pattern. At first, I didn't see it. Then I stepped around a cluster of roots at the base of a pine and caught the light at the right angle. There were cuts in the bark, fresh enough that the pale inner wood showed through in thin lines. Not deep gouges, but deliberate incisions, each one the same length, each one angled slightly to match the curve of the trunk. The marks were arranged in a tight cluster, just above knee height, like someone had knelt down and worked carefully with a blade. I crouched, heart thudding, and ran my eyes over them. 7 marks in a row. A short gap, 7 more, another gap, and then, starting again, 7 more. The beginnings of a new set. My mouth went dry. The repetition wasn't an accident. You don't cut the same number of lines in the same arrangement without intention. The spacing was consistent, the strokes similar. Whoever did it had taken their time. I leaned closer, squinting. The edges of the cuts were sharp. The wood inside was clean, not yet darkened by weather. If these marks had been made months ago, they'd look older, dirtier, less defined. These were recent, possibly from the night before. I sat back on my heels, staring at the cluster until my eyes started to ache. And that was when a memory surfaced, one I hadn't realized had planted itself so deeply in my head. The forum comment. Just make sure you actually leave when you say you will. The words came back with unexpected clarity, not as text on a screen, but as a voice in my mind, calm and flat. I remembered how it had bothered me without frightening me, how it had felt like advice wrapped around something else. I dismissed it because it wasn't dramatic, because it didn't scream danger, because it sounded like practicality. Now, crouched in the cold shade of the tree line, staring at these neat groups of marks, the comment didn't feel practical anymore. It felt procedural. I forced myself to look away, scanning the other trees nearby. Once you notice a pattern, your brain starts searching for it everywhere. It becomes a filter you can't turn off. I moved slowly along the edge of the clearing, pausing at each trunk, letting my eyes travel over the bark. More marks. Not on every tree, but on enough that my stomach turned. Some clusters were old, faint scars where the bark had begun to heal, the lines blurred by time. Others were fresher, pale wood exposed like open wounds. The arrangement was always similar. Sets of 7, grouped with small gaps, repeated like someone had been counting in a way that demanded structure. 7, 7, 7. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff, and backed away from the last tree I examined. A cold pressure settled in my chest. It wasn't just fear now. It was the sudden understanding that I'd stepped into a place where something was tracked, documented, repeated. I walked back toward the center of the clearing and stopped short, looking at my tent from a few yards away. The circle of footprints was still there, clean and obvious in the morning light. From this distance, the setup looked like a diagram, a center point, a boundary, and beyond it, the marks on the trees, quiet, methodical, like notes taken by someone who never intended to be caught. The thought that had been circling the edges of my mind finally landed. This wasn't a warning meant to scare me away. It was a record. I made myself breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you do when you're trying to keep a panic attack from taking over. The rational part of my brain wanted to grab my keys and go. It screamed at me that I didn't need more proof, that I didn't need to understand. Understanding was a luxury, and I was alone in a place where people had stood barefoot in the dark around my tent. The smart move was to leave. But another part of me, stubborn, analytical, the part that spent nights troubleshooting problems on servers no one else could fix, needed the pieces to connect. If this was random, I could dismiss it as a one-time nightmare. If it was a pattern, then it meant something else entirely. Time, duration, observation. Those were the 3 words that kept looping in my mind as I stared at the marks. The footprints showed position and proximity, how close they'd been, how many there were, how long they'd stood there. The tree marks showed repetition, consistent groups, consistent spacing, like an ongoing tally. A tally of what? My eyes flicked back to the circle around my tent, and the answer came so fast it made me feel nauseous. Nights, not steps, not miles, not days, nights. I remembered the comment again, the exact phrasing, the way it had been posted without context. Make sure you actually leave when you say you will. It wasn't written like a warning about weather or terrain. It wasn't about bears or getting lost. It was about staying, about duration, about the act of remaining in that space longer than you'd planned. The marks were counting something that only made sense over time, something you could measure in repeated intervals. And the most obvious interval in a place like this wasn't hours or minutes. It was nights. The time when you were vulnerable, when the world was dark and your senses were limited, when a thin wall of nylon was the only thing between you and whatever was moving in the trees. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep thinking even as my body begged me to stop. If they were counting nights, then the clusters on the trees weren't just random scratches. They were entries, records of how long someone stayed. 7 marks, pause, 7 marks, pause, weeks. A structured unit, a rhythm that could stretch on as long as someone remained in that clearing. My gaze slid back to the trees where the older scars lingered beneath new growth. That meant this wasn't a one-time thing. People had been here before. Many people. Long enough for bark to heal over old cuts. Long enough for new tallies to be added again and again. I suddenly understood why the clearing was so clean. It wasn't because no one used it. It was because the kind of people who used it didn't leave trash behind. They didn't light fires. They didn't build obvious signs of habitation. They didn't want to be found by casual campers or park rangers or anyone passing through. And the people who stumbled into it, people like me, either left quickly or stayed long enough to be counted. That thought landed in my chest like a weight. Counted by whom? The question should have been the center of my fear, but it wasn't. The fear was deeper than that, colder and more immediate, because the answer, whatever it was, didn't matter as much as the implication. If they were counting nights, then the footprints weren't just about watching. They were about monitoring, checking, confirming the count, seeing if I was still there, seeing if I was still alive. I glanced down at my tent again, at how small it looked from the outside, how temporary. And in that moment, the clearing didn't feel like a place I had chosen to camp. It felt like a place I had entered without permission, a place that had its own rules and its own routines, routines that continued whether I understood them or not. The worst part was the certainty that settled over me next. They had started counting me the moment I arrived. I should have left that morning. I thought about it seriously, keys in my hand, standing beside the car with the clearing spread out in front of me like a crime scene I didn't want to contaminate. Every instinct I trusted, the kind built from years of caution, habit, and quiet self-preservation, told me that staying was a mistake. But instincts don't always win when pride and disbelief get involved. And there was still a part of me clinging to the idea that what I'd seen could be explained if I just gave it a little more time. That was the lie I used. I told myself I would stay one more night. Just one. Long enough to prove to myself that the fear hadn't completely taken over my judgment. Long enough to convince myself that I hadn't driven hours into the woods just to scare myself into running away at the first sign of something I didn't understand. I packed most of my gear back into the car anyway. Food, extra clothes, anything I didn't need immediately. It was a compromise that made me feel smarter than I was being. The tent stayed up. The sleeping bag stayed inside. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd be gone by morning no matter what. The clearing felt different after that decision. Not hostile. Not yet. Just attentive. Like a room after you announce you're staying longer than expected, and someone, somewhere, adjusts their plans. The day passed slowly. Too slowly. I kept busy without accomplishing much. Pacing the perimeter, checking the same spots over and over again, as if repetition might dull the unease. The footprints remained visible, stark reminders etched into the ground. But I forced myself to treat them like landmarks rather than warnings. I avoided the trees with the marks, avoided looking too closely at the rope, avoided anything that might tip my balance from anxious into panicked. By late afternoon, the sky had clouded over, muting the light even further. The forest felt heavier, the air pressing down in a way that made my chest feel tight. I cooked another freeze-dried meal and ate it standing up, barely tasting it, my attention constantly drifting toward the tree line. Every sound made me pause. Every shift of shadow caught my eye. As evening settled in, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It wasn't sealed anymore. It was layered. I noticed it first in the way sound traveled. When I zipped my jacket, the noise didn't just vanish. It seemed to linger, stretched thin, as if the clearing itself was holding on to it. When I took a step, the crunch of needles felt sharper, more exposed. The forest didn't absorb sound the way it had the first night. It reflected it. I told myself I was imagining it. Then the sounds started. They were subtle at first, so faint I almost missed them. A soft shift somewhere beyond the trees. Not footsteps exactly, more like the suggestion of movement, the disturbance of air, a branch settling after being brushed aside. The noises were closer than the night before, just inside the edge of the clearing, and they didn't bother trying to hide. That was what changed. The first night had felt like observation. Careful, distant, measured. This felt confident. I stood near my tent, hands at my sides, listening. The sounds came again, from a different angle this time. Not circling, not pacing, just repositioning, as if whoever was out there already knew the layout of the space and didn't need to test it anymore. My heartbeat picked up, each thud heavy and deliberate. I waited for whispers, but they didn't come right away. Instead, there was a new sound, low, almost imperceptible, like breath being released slowly through the nose. It drifted in and out of my hearing, never lingering long enough to be certain of. I took a step back toward the tent. The sound followed, not rushing, not reacting sharply, just keeping pace. That was when the realization began to take shape, slow and unwelcome. They weren't checking if I was still here. They already knew. The pressure built as the light faded, the shadows deepening until the clearing looked smaller, the tree line creeping inward again. I moved closer to the tent, my body angling unconsciously toward it like a magnet finding north. The nylon walls didn't feel reassuring anymore. They felt symbolic, a thin declaration of presence. The sounds multiplied as darkness settled fully in. Not louder, but more frequent. Small movements from different directions, close enough now that I could sense them without hearing them clearly. The air itself felt disturbed, as if it were being displaced by careful, controlled motion. I zipped myself into the tent before full night fell, not because I felt safer inside, but because being outside felt worse. The moment the zipper closed, the sounds shifted again. I could hear them more clearly now. Soft contacts against the ground, subtle adjustments, the faint scrape of something brushing bark. Closer, more assured. I sat with my back against the tent wall, knees drawn up, listening. The forest didn't go silent this time. It stayed active, but the activity felt focused, directed. Each sound landed with intention, like punctuation rather than background noise. I realized then that nothing I'd heard suggested surprise. No startled movements, no sudden retreats, no hesitation. Whatever was out there wasn't reacting to me anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for night to fully claim the clearing. Waiting for me to settle into place. Waiting for the count to continue. The weight of that understanding settled over me slowly, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I thought about the marks on the trees, the careful grouping, the sense of routine embedded in every detail I'd seen. I thought about how clean the clearing was, how untouched it had seemed. This wasn't a place meant for lingering. It was a place meant for passing through. And as the sounds pressed closer, more confident with every minute, I understood something that made my skin crawl. Staying a second night hadn't made me braver. It had made me overdue. I don't remember deciding to go look for it. I just remember standing outside the tent with my headlamp off, the darkness thick enough that it felt textured, and realizing that the sounds had shifted again. They weren't closer in the way I'd learned to dread. No careful repositioning, no soft contacts brushing the ground. Instead, there was a subtle absence on one side of the clearing, like a gap where something had been moments earlier and had now moved on. The imbalance tugged at me. I told myself it was a mistake to follow that instinct. I told myself that curiosity had already gotten me this far and that it would only make things worse. But there's a particular kind of pressure that builds when you know something is being arranged around you. It doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels like a prompt. I zipped my jacket higher and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, careful to keep my movements slow and deliberate. The needles underfoot barely made a sound. I angled my body so I could see both the tree line and my tent in my peripheral vision, unwilling to turn my back fully on either. The headlamp stayed off. I didn't want to announce myself. I didn't want to show them exactly where I was looking. The smell reached me first. It was faint, diluted by the cool night air, but unmistakable now that I knew it. Not the sharpness of blood, not rot in the way people imagine it. It was older than that, sour and stagnant like damp fur left too long in the shade, the kind of smell that clings to fabric and refuses to air out. I slowed even more, my pulse ticking loudly in my ears. The smell led me toward the same stretch of trees where I'd found the tent frame and the rope earlier. The headlamp beam flicked on briefly, then off again, just long enough to confirm I was in the right place. I didn't want to keep it on. I didn't want to illuminate the space any more than necessary. Something pale caught the light. I stopped. The object hung at about waist height, suspended from a low branch a few feet inside the tree line. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a shape interrupting the darkness, an irregular silhouette against the bark. It didn't move, even when a faint breeze stirred the upper branches. I took another step, then another, until I was close enough to see what it was. A small animal. I couldn't tell what kind immediately. Something common. Something you'd see without thinking twice on the side of a road. Its body was intact, positioned carefully, not sprawled or torn. There was no blood dripping, no obvious violence displayed. The fur was matted in places, stiff, the limbs arranged in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. It had been tied up, not crudely, not hastily. A thin line, fishing line maybe, looped around its body and secured to the branch above. The knot was neat, efficient, the kind of knot someone ties when they know exactly how much tension they need. I didn't get closer than that. I didn't need to. The way it was placed told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a kill left behind by a predator. Animals don't suspend their prey. They don't arrange it at eye level. They don't choose spots that sit just at the boundary between open space and cover. This had been positioned to be found. My stomach tightened as the implication settled in. This wasn't a warning meant to scare me off in a hurry. It wasn't frantic or angry. It was controlled. Calm. Almost instructional. I scanned the surrounding area, my headlamp clicking on for a split second at a time. No tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle. The ground beneath the animal was undisturbed, the needles lying flat, as if whoever had placed it there had been careful not to leave anything else behind. I thought about the footprints around my tent, about the way they'd formed a circle without an obvious entry or exit, about the marks on the trees, the careful groups, the repetition. This fit. Not as escalation, but as punctuation, a message delivered after observation. I took a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the suspended shape. The smell seemed stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat. I fought the urge to gag, not because it was overwhelming, but because it carried with it a kind of intimacy I didn't want. It meant someone had been close. Recently. Close enough to touch, to tie, to step back and check their work. I realized then that I wasn't supposed to be seeing this by accident. If I'd stayed in the center of the clearing, if I'd kept my headlamp on, if I'd tried to ignore the shift in sound and go to sleep, I might not have noticed it until morning. Or at all. But I hadn't done that. I'd gone looking. The thought made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, careful not to trip. careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to the tent, to pack what I could and leave immediately. But something held me in place for a few more seconds. I looked past the animal, deeper into the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, no eyes reflecting light, no whisper of sound. Just darkness layered between trunks, impenetrable and patient. It wasn't absence, it was restraint. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about threat, it was about demonstration. The animal hadn't been left to shock me or horrify me. It hadn't been mutilated or displayed in a way meant to provoke panic. It was clean, deliberate, quiet. It said, without words, "This is possible." It said, "This is easy." It said, "This is what happens here." I turned and walked back toward the clearing, my movements stiff, my thoughts racing. The tent looked absurdly small from the tree line, a thin shape of fabric sitting exposed in the open. The circle of footprints around it was still faintly visible in the headlamp's beam, the marks catching light in shallow depressions. I stopped at the edge of that circle and didn't step inside it right away. A realization pressed down on me, heavy and cold. They hadn't done this because I stayed a second night. They'd done it because I was never meant to stay longer than the first. The message wasn't leave now. It was you should have already gone. I stepped back into the circle and stood there for a long moment, listening to the forest breathe around me. The sounds hadn't returned yet. The whispers were gone. The movement had receded, but the pressure hadn't lifted. It had simply shifted into something quieter, more final. I knew then that whatever routine governed this place, whatever counting had been done before I arrived, had reached a point of conclusion with me. Not because I'd been chosen, not because I was special, but because I'd missed my window. And the display hanging in the trees was the only explanation I was going to get. I didn't hesitate after that. There was no debate, no internal negotiation, no voice left in my head trying to frame staying as bravery or curiosity. Whatever illusion I'd been clinging to dissolved the moment I stepped back into the clearing and looked at my tent again, framed by those footprints like a boundary I'd crossed without understanding the terms. I was done. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt mechanical, almost clinical, like flipping a switch that should have been flipped hours ago. My hands moved before my thoughts could interfere, reaching for zippers, straps, buckles. I didn't sit down. I didn't pause. I packed standing up, movements short and efficient, the way you do when you know stopping would give fear time to catch up. Every sound felt exposed. The rip of Velcro echoed too loudly. The soft thud of gear hitting the ground made my shoulders tense. I found myself wincing at each noise, waiting for a reaction that never quite came. The forest stayed quiet. Not empty, not calm, just restrained, like it was watching without needing to announce itself. I kept my headlamp off as long as I could, working by memory and faint ambient light filtering through the trees. When I finally clicked it on, the beam felt intrusive, a narrow tunnel of visibility cutting through the dark. I swept it across the clearing once, quick and controlled, then forced myself to stop. I didn't want to look for shapes. I didn't want to confirm anything I couldn't take back. The footprints were still there. I avoided them as best I could, stepping carefully between impressions, my boots landing in untouched patches of dirt. It felt wrong to disturb them, like erasing evidence that wasn't meant for me to erase. Every time my foot came down, I had the uncomfortable sense that I was stepping into a space someone else had measured precisely. As I stuffed the tent into its bag, the fabric fighting me like it always did, I became acutely aware of the clearing's edges, not in a visual way, in a physical one. The pressure I'd felt the night before returned, subtle but unmistakable, pressing in from the trees. I wasn't hearing anything. That was the problem. The absence of sound didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt deliberate, controlled, like silence being maintained rather than occurring naturally. My breathing sounded too loud, each inhale and exhale a potential signal. I forced myself to slow it down, counting under my breath, keeping my movements steady. I loaded the gear into the car as quickly as I could without making obvious mistakes. Sleeping bag, pack, stove. The empty space in the trunk shrank with each item, and with it came a strange sense of urgency. Not panic exactly, but the awareness that time mattered now in a way it hadn't before. Halfway through, I stopped. The feeling hit me all at once, sharp and undeniable. I was being watched, not in the vague, abstract way I'd felt since the first night. This was focused, directional, like attention narrowing in, fixing on me with purpose. I didn't turn around. I didn't scan the tree line. I just stood there, one hand resting on the edge of the trunk, the other gripping a strap, my body frozen in mid-motion. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no whispers, no breath. Just that same oppressive quiet. The forest holding itself unnaturally still. I finished packing without looking up. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes down, to avoid making contact with whatever awareness pressed against the clearing. The thought of locking eyes with something out there, of confirming its presence in a way that couldn't be denied, felt unbearable. When the trunk finally closed with a dull, solid thump, I flinched despite myself. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, stretching out before dissolving into the silence. I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, the familiar click of the lock sending a thin thread of relief through my chest. The interior of the car felt impossibly small, a fragile bubble of glass and metal surrounded by trees that suddenly seemed much closer than they had before. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught. The sound was deafening. I half expected something to react to it, to rush forward, to make itself known now that I'd broken the quiet so completely. Instead, the forest absorbed the noise without complaint. The headlights cut across the clearing, illuminating trunks, low branches, the disturbed ground where I'd walked. Nothing moved. I put the car in reverse and eased back, tires crunching softly over dirt and needles. As the vehicle shifted, my headlights swept across the tree line one last time, for a split second, just long enough for doubt to take root. I thought I saw something change. Not a figure stepping forward, not eyes reflecting light. Just the subtle impression that the darkness between two trees was deeper than it should have been, like a space deliberately left unlit. Then it was gone. I didn't stop. I turned onto the narrow road, the car bumping and swaying as I navigated back the way I'd come. The clearing disappeared behind me quickly, swallowed by trees, the sense of pressure easing only slightly as distance grew between us. But even as I drove, even as the forest began to thin and the road widened just enough to feel marginally safer, the feeling didn't leave completely. It lingered, like attention withdrawn, not lost. I didn't feel chased. I didn't hear anything following me, but I couldn't shake the certainty that my departure was being noted, marked in whatever quiet system governed that place. I had made the right decision. I just wasn't sure I'd made it soon enough. I wish I could say that once I decided to leave, everything became simple. that I acted like the version of myself I'd always believed I was: calm, competent, prepared. The kind of guy who doesn't panic because panic wastes time. The truth is, my hands betrayed me almost immediately. The moment I started moving with real urgency, my body shifted into a different gear. My fingers lost their usual precision. My grip tightened too hard, then loosened at the wrong moment. I kept dropping things, not because they were heavy, but because my brain couldn't stop splitting its attention between what I was doing and what I thought might be watching me do it. The first thing I dropped was the tent stake bag. It slipped from my hand and hit the dirt with a dull, insulting little thud. That sound felt louder than the engine had. It felt like a signal. I froze for half a second, heart kicking, listening for a reaction that didn't come. Then I crouched, snatched it up, and shoved it into my pack so hard the zipper snagged. The snag nearly broke me. A tiny mechanical failure, nothing more. But in that moment, it felt like the clearing was pushing back, like the place itself didn't want me to leave cleanly. I yanked the zipper free with trembling fingers, teeth scraping loudly, and winced at the sound. My ears stayed tuned to the tree line, to the gaps between trunks, waiting for the slightest shift, the faintest whisper. Nothing. That was worse. Silence wasn't neutral here. I'd learned that. Silence meant control. It meant something was choosing not to make noise, choosing not to reveal position, choosing to let me do what I was doing without interference, because interference wasn't necessary yet. I kept packing anyway. I stuffed the sleeping bag into its sack, but my hands were clumsy, and the fabric fought me like it always does. Normally, I'd kneel and roll it carefully, compressing air out with practiced patience. This time, I jammed it, forced it, shoved my knee into it until the seams strained. The bag barely fit. I cursed under my breath, not because I cared about the gear, but because the effort made noise, soft grunts, the scrape of nylon, my own breath catching too loudly in the cold air. I stopped and listened again. The forest stayed still. The wind didn't move the branches. The clearing didn't offer a single ordinary sound to hide behind. Every noise I made stood alone, clean and exposed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that each one was being noted. I glanced toward my tent, still half standing, poles slightly bowed as I pulled the fabric loose. The circle of footprints around it looked different now in daylight, less like something mystical and more like something humiliating. Like evidence I'd been surrounded while I lay there pretending not to exist. The marks weren't chaotic. They were placed, like someone had stepped into their positions with purpose and stayed until they were satisfied. I tried not to look at them too long. I had a brief, sharp urge to photograph everything. The footprints, the tree marks, the rope, the clearing itself. Proof. Something I could show someone later to make the story sound less insane. But as soon as the thought formed, another one followed, colder and quieter. If I took pictures, I'd be admitting this was real in a way I couldn't take back. I'd be carrying it out with me. I'd be turning it into something permanent. And something in me, some part still clinging to denial, didn't want that. So I didn't take photos. I focused on the mechanics instead. Fold, stuff, zip, strap, load. My entire world narrowed to those actions, a sequence of tasks that kept my mind from spiraling too far ahead. But no matter how hard I tried to stay grounded, the awareness never left. It hovered at the edge of every movement, like a shadow you can't outstep. Once, while I was lifting my pack into the trunk, the strap caught on the latch and snapped back, slapping loudly against the metal. The sound cracked through the clearing like a gunshot. I flinched so hard I nearly stumbled. My heart jumped into my throat. For a split second, I was certain that was it, that the stillness would break, that something would rush forward now that I'd made myself so obvious. Nothing happened. The silence held. The absence felt like a smile I couldn't see. I slammed the trunk shut harder than I meant to and immediately regretted it. The sound reverberated faintly, dying out too quickly, swallowed by the trees. I stood there with my keys in hand, chest rising and falling, trying to calm myself down enough to drive without doing something stupid. That's when I noticed the way my breathing sounded outside. In the tent, at least the fabric had muffled it. Out here, it was just me and open air. Each breath felt loud enough to broadcast. I forced myself to take slower inhales, but that only made me more aware of the cold filling my lungs, of the faint tremor in my hands, of the sweat cooling at the base of my neck. I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, sealing myself behind glass. It should have made me feel safe. Instead, it made me feel like I'd put myself in a container, transparent, fragile, easy to locate. I started the engine, and the sound flooded the clearing. The rumble should have been comforting, a familiar mechanical presence replacing the unnatural quiet. But when the noise filled the space, it didn't drown the fear, it sharpened it. It felt like the only loud thing in a place that wanted to stay quiet. I put the car in reverse, and before I moved an inch, I had the sudden, irrational certainty that something had shifted in the trees. Not because I saw it, because I felt it, like a tension tightening, aligning with my motion. I checked the mirrors. Nothing. Just trunks and shadows and my own reflection in the glass. I backed out anyway, slow and careful, tires crunching, and listened so hard for anything behind me that I almost didn't notice how badly my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The path out was narrower than I remembered. Or maybe it only felt that way because now I was aware of what the forest could hide. The road wasn't a road in the way most people mean it. It was a corridor. 2 dirt tracks pressed into earth, flanked by trees close enough that their branches brushed the sides of my car with a soft, dragging sound. Each scrape made my shoulders tense as if the car itself were being touched. Backing out was torture. I had driven in forward, weaving around branches and potholes with the casual confidence of someone who still believed in maps and plans. Now I had to reverse the entire way back to where the road widened enough to turn around, and every few feet the tires slipped slightly in loose gravel, forcing me to correct, to inch, to adjust. The steering wheel felt too sensitive, my hands too shaky, my depth perception warped by adrenaline. I kept the headlights on full blast even though the sun was up, the beams cutting pale lines between trees. It made no practical difference, but psychologically I needed the light. I needed something bright and artificial in a place that had spent the night proving how easily darkness could be used. The car's interior smelled faintly of plastic and old fabric, familiar, normal. But my senses stayed tuned outward. I listened for footsteps that could match my speed, for a whisper that might drift through the open crack of the window, for anything that would confirm I wasn't leaving alone. The only sounds were mechanical: engine rumble, tire crunch, the faint rattle of gear shifting in the trunk whenever I hit a bump. The air vents hummed softly, pushing out cool air I didn't need. I realized, with a strange jolt, that the hum almost sounded like my apartment's refrigerator. Steady, mindless, comforting. It made my chest tighten. Then the road dipped. A shallow incline followed by a muddy patch I'd barely noticed on the way in. I eased the car backward slowly, trying not to spin the tires. The The wheels slipped anyway, gravel giving way to damp soil, and for a moment, the car rocked in place without moving. My heart kicked hard. I pressed the brake, then the gas lightly, coaxing it. The tires grabbed and released in short jerks. The car moved an inch, then stopped again. The steering wheel vibrated under my palms, and a flicker of panic shot through me so fast it made my vision narrow. Don't get stuck here. My mind supplied images I didn't want. Footprints appearing around the car the way they'd appeared around my tent. A silent circle tightening while I sat trapped with the engine running. I forced the thought away and focused on the practical. I shifted into neutral, then back into reverse, trying again with a gentler touch. The car slid backward another few inches. I exhaled shakily, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. And then the engine stalled. It didn't cough first. It didn't sputter. It simply died. The sudden silence was so abrupt, it felt like someone had reached into the car and pulled the sound out by hand. One moment, there was vibration, mechanical reassurance, the constant rumble that proved I could still move. The next, there was nothing but the soft ticking of cooling metal and my own breathing, loud and ragged in the sealed interior. My stomach dropped. For half a second, I couldn't move. My hands stayed frozen on the wheel, my mind blank except for the raw animal certainty that this was the moment the forest had been waiting for. In the stillness, I heard something outside. A small sound, barely more than a shift, like pressure in the dirt, the subtle displacement of weight. Not close enough to see through the windshield, not loud enough to identify, but present enough to make my scalp tighten. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to act. The key was still in the ignition. My fingers fumbled as I turned it. Too fast, too desperate. The starter clicked once, hollow and sharp. The engine didn't catch. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I tried again, slower, as if patience could coax it back. The starter clicked, the engine turned over, and for a heartbeat it sounded like it might ignite. Then it fell back into silence. The ticking of metal continued, steady and indifferent. Outside, the forest remained still, too still, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to daytime. I forced myself not to look wildly around. Panic makes you clumsy. Clumsiness gets you stuck. I focused on the simple steps I'd learned over years of driving old cars and dealing with minor mechanical failures. Foot off the gas, key back, breathe, try again. My hand trembled so badly I had to grip the key with 2 fingers to steady it. I turned it again. This time the engine coughed, one rough, ugly sound, then caught, rumbling back to life like it had never left. The sudden vibration flooded the cabin, and I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. I didn't give it time to fail again. I pressed the gas gently, and the tires finally grabbed, pulling the car backward out of the muddy patch. The road leveled, and I kept moving, refusing to stop even when branches scraped the sides and the trunk rattled with each bump. But something had changed. The stall wasn't just a mechanical hiccup. It felt like a reminder, like the clearing had reached out one last time to show me how quickly sound could be taken away, how fragile my control was. I couldn't shake the thought that the silence hadn't been accidental, that it had arrived too perfectly, too suddenly, like a door shutting. I kept reversing, inch by inch, until the road widened enough that I could finally swing the car around. When I turned and faced the direction back toward civilization, sunlight hit the windshield, and for a moment it felt like I'd made it. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just dirt tracks and trees. But the certainty remained, cold and unwavering, that the moment my engine died, something out there had stepped closer, and then stepped back again when it came to life. Leaving, I realized, didn't mean it was over. It just meant I'd been allowed to go. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until my lungs started to burn. The car was moving forward now, finally, the road widening just enough that I didn't have to fight the steering wheel with every inch. The engine's rumble stayed steady, a fragile promise that I clung to harder than I cared to admit. Gravel popped under the tires. Branches stopped scraping the doors. The forest began to loosen its grip, opening up in small, reluctant increments. I should have felt relief. Instead, a different sensation settled in, one that felt heavier, more deliberate. The sense that the danger hadn't followed me so much as it had repositioned itself. Like whatever governed that clearing didn't need to pursue. It only needed to be seen one last time. The road curved gently to the left, and I slowed instinctively, easing my foot off the gas. Sunlight filtered through the trees at a low angle, striping the windshield with bands of gold and shadow. My eyes tracked the edges of the road automatically now, scanning for movement without consciously deciding to do so. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain refused to process what my eyes were registering. It filed the shape away as a trick of light, a trick of exhaustion, another branch leaning at the wrong angle. I told myself that before I even finished seeing it. Then the shape resolved. Between two trees, about 30 feet off the road, something stood. Not crouched, not moving, standing. It was partially obscured by shadow, the kind that gathers thickly at the base of trunks where sunlight doesn't quite reach. I couldn't make out details, not clothing, not facial features, not even clear proportions. What I could see was posture, upright, balanced, intentional. It wasn't trying to hide. That was the detail that sent a shock through me. Most of the time, when you glimpse movement in the woods, it's fleeting. A deer bolting, a bird taking off, something that registers as alive because it reacts to being seen. This didn't react at all. It remained exactly where it was, as if visibility didn't matter anymore. I slowed the car further without meaning to, my foot hovering uncertainly over the brake. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles whitening. My heart hammered hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The shape didn't move. It didn't lean forward. It didn't retreat deeper into the trees. It didn't raise an arm or shift its weight. It simply stood there, occupying space with the quiet confidence of something that had never needed to hurry. For a brief, horrifying moment, I wondered if there was more than one. My eyes darted to the surrounding trunks, scanning for additional shapes, additional shadows that didn't quite line up. The forest was full of vertical lines, trees packed close together, their forms overlapping and merging in the dappled light. It would have been easy to miss something standing still among them. That thought alone made my stomach churn. I forced my eyes back to the original spot. The figure was still there. The car rolled forward another few feet, and the angle changed just enough for me to see a little more. Not enough to identify, but enough to confirm it wasn't a trick of bark or shadow. There was a clear separation between the dark mass and the tree behind it. A gap, depth, a presence. I didn't see eyes. I didn't see a face. But I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely, that it was looking at me. Not staring, not tracking my movement. Just aware. The way you're aware of a passing car from the corner of your eye. The way you register something without needing to focus on it. That was the feeling it gave off. Not predatory, not frantic. Observational, like a box being checked. I thought about stopping. The idea surfaced fully formed and utterly insane. Put the car in park, step out, demand an explanation. Shout. Break the silence on my own terms. Prove to myself that I wasn't running from a shadow. The idea died as quickly as it appeared. I knew, deep in my bones, that if I stopped, the situation would change in a way I couldn't control. Whatever rules applied right now, whatever unspoken agreement was allowing me to leave, would no longer apply. So I kept driving. The engine noise felt painfully loud again, a mechanical intrusion slicing through the stillness of the forest. The car crept forward, and the angle shifted more. The trees slid past in my peripheral vision, trunks lining up and overlapping until the space where the figure stood began to close. For one last second, there was a clear gap between two trees. The shape was still there. Then the road curved again, and the forest swallowed the view completely. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. My foot pressed down on the gas a little harder, not enough to lose control, just enough to put distance between myself and that stretch of road. My pulse thudded painfully in my ears, each beat echoing the same thought over and over. It didn't chase me. It didn't need to. Chasing implies urgency, desire, effort. What I'd seen didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like confirmation, like something standing where it always stood, watching people come and go, noting who left when they were supposed to and who didn't. The kind of thing that didn't have to follow because it knew exactly where you'd been and exactly how long you'd stayed. As the forest finally began to thin and the road widened into something closer to a real service road, the tension in my chest eased just enough for me to breathe properly again. Sunlight grew stronger. Shadows softened. The world started to look ordinary, but the image stayed with me. Not as a face, not as a figure I could describe to anyone else, as a posture, upright, still, unhurried, waiting for the next person to arrive.
The first sign that I was back in the real world wasn't a building or a person. It was noise. At some point, the trees thinned enough that the road widened into cracked pavement again, and the car's tires stopped crunching on gravel and started humming steadily on asphalt. The sound was smooth, continuous, almost comforting. I kept driving like that for a while, not really thinking, letting the momentum carry me forward, as if the act of moving fast enough could erase what had happened behind me. Then my phone buzzed. One short vibration against the center console, so ordinary it felt obscene. The screen lit up, searching for signal, and for a second, I just stared at it like it was a foreign object. When the bars finally appeared, they didn't bring relief the way they should have. They brought a kind of shame, like I'd been allowed back into civilization on borrowed time, like I'd returned without earning it. I didn't call anyone, not right away. I didn't even text my brother to say I was okay. My hands were still shaky, my mouth still dry, and the idea of hearing another human voice felt wrong. Too normal, too intimate, like it might make the whole thing collapse into something I couldn't control. Traffic gradually increased. A pickup passed me going the opposite direction, dust trailing behind it, the driver's arm hanging out the window. A minivan with a roof rack followed. Kids' faces pressed briefly to the glass as it went by. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. The kind of thing I'd spent months feeling disconnected from. Seeing them now didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel out of place. When I finally merged onto the highway, the landscape opened up. The sky looked too wide, The shoulders of the road were lined with scrub and low grass, and the sun hit my windshield hard enough that I had to squint. Cars moved around me at normal speeds, their engines blending into a constant low roar that filled the air like white noise. I expected my body to relax. Instead, my nerves stayed wound tight, waiting for a silence that never came. That was the strange part about returning, how the city's noise didn't drown the memory of the woods. It didn't overwrite it. It sat on top of it, layered, like two radio stations playing at once. I kept hearing the clearing in the gaps between sounds, in the brief moment between one car passing and another, in the quiet pause when I stopped at a red light and the engines around me idled. My mind kept reaching back, uninvited, to that unnatural stillness, the way the forest had muted itself, the way silence had dropped when I spoke, as if sound had been turned off rather than fading naturally. It had rewired something in me. It made normal quiet feel suspicious, like it wasn't empty unless it could prove it. I pulled off the highway at the first exit that had anything open, one of those strip mall clusters built around a gas station and fast food signs. The kind of place that looks identical no matter what state you're in. Bright colors, cheap pavement, fluorescent lights, even in daylight. I needed coffee. But more than that, I needed to stand somewhere public and let my brain remember what it felt like to be surrounded by people. I parked under a tall light pole and sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. The air smelled like hot asphalt and gasoline. A delivery truck rumbled past, brakes squealing softly. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. None of it bothered me the way it used to. It wasn't annoying. It was grounding. It was proof that the world still operated on ordinary rules. I walked into a coffee shop attached to the gas station, one of those places that tried too hard to feel cozy. All fake wood paneling and soft music that didn't quite cover the buzz of refrigeration units behind the counter. The bell over the door chimed as I entered, and the sound made my shoulders jump. The cashier looked up and said something cheerful. "Morning." And I nodded like I knew how to respond, like I hadn't spent the last 2 nights feeling as if speech itself could trigger consequences. I ordered black coffee. My voice came out steadier than I expected, but my hands gave me away when I reached for my wallet. They were still trembling slightly, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but enough that I did. The cashier handed me a cup with a cardboard sleeve, and the heat against my palm felt almost painfully real. I found a table near the window and sat down. The coffee shop was half full. A couple in matching workout clothes. A man in a reflective vest scrolling on his phone. 2 teenagers laughing too loudly at something on a screen. Ordinary life. I stared at them like I was trying to relearn the shapes of normal human behavior. The sounds layered together in a way that should have been comforting. Low conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, ice clinking in plastic cups, the dull thump of the refrigerator door closing behind the counter. But something about it felt wrong. Not threatening, just wrong, in a way that made my skin itch. In the clearing, every sound had meant something because there were so few of them. A zipper click, a scrape, a whisper. Each one landed with intent. Here, sound was careless. People laughed without thinking about how it carried. Someone dropped a spoon, and nobody froze. Nobody listened. Nobody waited for the silence to react. I tried to tell myself that was the point. That this was safety. that nothing in this bright, ordinary room was paying attention to me. And yet, every time the coffee shop grew briefly quiet, every time conversation paused for a beat, every time the music dipped between songs, I felt my stomach tighten. I kept expecting the stillness to sharpen, to become that engineered silence again, to feel that pressure in the air, the sense of a tension aligning with my movement. It never happened. But the fact that I expected it, that my body prepared for it automatically, made something sink in with slow, sick certainty. The woods hadn't just scared me, it had changed my baseline for what silence meant. When I finished my coffee, I sat there a little longer than I needed to, watching cars move through the parking lot, watching people come and go, letting the noise wash over me like I was trying to scrub something off my skin. I finally texted my brother one short message. Back. All good. He replied almost immediately. Thank God. Where'd you end up going? I stared at his question for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. The answer felt trapped in my throat, even though no one could hear it. I could describe highways and exits and coffee shops easily. I could name towns. I could give him a vague region. But the clearing, the too clean ground, the footprints, the marks, the rope, felt like saying it out loud would make it real in a way I couldn't afford. So I did what I'd been doing since the divorce, since the late nights, since the moment I saw a shadow pass my apartment window and chose not to look. I lied in a small, practical way. Just found a quiet spot off a service road, I typed. Nothing crazy. Needed the reset. Then I put the phone face down on the table as if that could keep the past from calling back. Outside, the highway lights flickered faintly as the day shifted, and for a moment, their steady glow reminded me of something I didn't want to remember. The reflective marker on the way in, flashing like a signal, and the way it hadn't been there on the way out. I finished my coffee and walked back to the car, telling myself I was safe now. But as I drove back onto the highway, surrounded by traffic and sunlight and noise, one thought stayed with me like a shadow tucked just out of sight. It had let me leave, and I still didn't know why. It took a few days for my hands to stop shaking. Not completely, just enough that I could pretend they weren't anymore. I went back to my apartment, unpacked the gear I hadn't bothered cleaning, and tried to slide back into the version of my life that existed before the trip. The refrigerator hummed the way it always had. The air conditioner kicked on and off at predictable intervals. My laptop fan whined softly as I logged back into work, tickets piling up exactly where I'd left them. Everything looked the same. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt staged, like a set rebuilt too quickly after something violent had happened just off camera. I didn't think about the clearing for the first couple of days. Not directly. I avoided it the same way you avoid a sore tooth. Careful not to poke at it. Careful not to test whether it still hurt. But avoidance takes effort, and effort eventually fails when you're alone at night with nothing but time. It happened around 1:30 a.m. I was sitting on my couch with my laptop open, half watching something I couldn't follow, when my mind drifted back to the marks on the trees. Not the fear of them, the structure, the repetition, the discipline behind it. 7 marks. A pause. 7 more. I told myself it was meaningless, arbitrary. Humans love patterns. We invent them even when none exist. But the thought didn't let go. It stayed, pressing lightly, insistently, the way a loose thread keeps catching your finger. So I opened my notes app. I hadn't written anything down during the trip. No timestamps, no photos, no recordings. That had been a conscious choice, one I still couldn't fully explain. But I remembered enough. Arrival day, first night, second night, morning, departure. I started listing dates. I checked my calendar to confirm when I'd left the apartment, when I'd taken PTO, when I'd sent that vague text to my brother. I cross-referenced it with my location history, not the clearing itself, which didn't exist on any map, but the nearest towns, the gas station, the coffee shop. 2 nights. That was how long I'd stayed. 2 nights in the clearing. 14 marks. 7 and 7. My chest tightened slightly, but I forced myself to keep going. I pulled up the forum again. It took longer than I expected to find the post. The site looked even older than I remembered. Threads buried under newer comments. Broken links scattered everywhere. When I finally found the discussion about unofficial backcountry sites, my pulse picked up in a way I didn't like. The comment was still there. Same username. Same flat tone. Just make sure you actually leave when you say you will. I stared at it for a long time, then clicked through the user's profile. There wasn't much. A handful of posts over several years, all in similar threads, all offering advice that didn't sound like advice until you read it twice. One line caught my attention. Most people don't realize they're staying longer than they think. I scrolled, my mouth dry. Someone had replied to that comment years ago, asking what they meant. There was no answer. I went back to the tree marks in my mind, replaying them with a clarity that made my skin crawl. The older scars beneath newer cuts. The way some groups were faint, half-healed, while others looked fresh. This wasn't just counting nights for one person. It was cumulative. I opened another tab and started counting backward. Not days, weeks. I counted in groups of 7. 7 days, 14, 21. I stopped when the count lined up with the week I'd left my apartment. The realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in, quiet and methodical, like the sounds in the clearing had. The marks weren't reset when someone left. They weren't erased or started over. They accumulated. They kept going. I leaned back on the couch, my heart thudding harder now, the room suddenly feeling too small. If the marks corresponded to weeks, if each group represented someone staying beyond a threshold, then the clearing wasn't just tracking presence, it was tracking duration across time. I thought about how clean the place had been, how no one left trash, how no fire rings existed, how nothing suggested casual, repeated use. People didn't camp there for weekends. They didn't linger unless they didn't know they were doing it, unless they thought they had more time. My phone buzzed suddenly, a work notification, and I nearly dropped it. The sound echoed too sharply in my ears. I muted it and sat there in the dark, the glow of the laptop casting pale light across the room. A thought surfaced that made my stomach turn. What if the count wasn't about how long you stayed in the clearing? What if it was about how long you were observed? I closed the laptop and stood up, pacing the length of the apartment. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. And yet every time I passed the window, I felt the urge to glance outside, just to check the street, the parked cars, the shadows between them. I didn't see anything, but the certainty remained. Leaving the clearing hadn't ended anything. It had just changed the context. I don't go into forests anymore. Not the way I used to. Not alone. Not off marked trails. I still hike occasionally, still tell people I enjoy the quiet, but it's a curated quiet now. State parks, maintained paths, places where sound never fully disappears, places where silence can't organize itself. I tell myself it's just preference. The truth is, there are places I won't drive past anymore. Certain service roads, certain stretches of highway where the trees grow too close together, where the shoulders narrow, and the light changes in a way that reminds me of that clearing. I feel it in my chest before I recognize it consciously, a tightening that tells me to keep moving. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. Not clearly, not loud enough to point to a source, just a faint suggestion of sound when everything else is quiet. A scrape that stops when I stop breathing, a whisper that doesn't form words. I've learned not to react to it, learned that listening too hard only makes it feel closer. I never went back to the forum. I never replied to the comment. I never asked questions I didn't want answered, because the thing I'm most afraid of isn't what was in the clearing. It's what might still be connected to me. I've checked the dates more times than I want to admit. I've counted weeks the same way I counted tree marks in my head. I've tried to convince myself the alignment is coincidence, that I'm projecting meaning onto numbers because I need closure. But numbers don't care what you need. And every so often, when I'm lying awake in my apartment and the refrigerator hum cuts out for a split second before kicking back on, I feel that same pressure in the air. That same sense of attention tightening, not rushing, not chasing, observing. I don't know if the count ever resets. I don't know if leaving removed me from it, or if it simply moved the boundary. I only know that whatever rules governed that place didn't feel finished when I left. They felt paused. That's why I'm writing this now. Not as a warning, not as a confession meant to scare anyone, just as a record, in case patterns matter more than we think. If you've ever stayed somewhere just a little longer than you planned, if you've ever told yourself you'd leave in the morning and then didn't, if you've ever felt watched in a place that was supposed to be empty, pay attention. Because the worst part isn't being seen. It's realizing that the counting might not stop when you leave. And that listening right now means you might already be part of it. This story stayed with me in a way that few horror narratives do. Not because it was frightening in a traditional sense, but because it felt disturbingly familiar. Long after the final line, what lingered wasn't an image of danger, but a feeling. The quiet unease of realizing that some experiences don't end just because we walk away from them. At its core, this story isn't really about the woods, or the figures, or even the act of being watched. It's about boundaries, the ones we respect, the ones we ignore, and the ones we don't realize exist until we cross them. The forest becomes a mirror rather than a monster. It reflects a very human habit, our assumption that time, space, and safety are things we automatically control. The narrator enters the clearing, believing what many of us believe when we seek solitude or escape, that stepping away from society means freedom. No rules, no oversight, no expectations, just silence and self-determination. That belief feels especially relatable in a world where so many people feel overwhelmed, disconnected, or hollowed out by routine. Wanting to disappear for a while isn't weakness. It's a response to pressure. The story honors that impulse instead of mocking it, which is part of why it feels so grounded. What makes the horror effective is that it never announces itself. There is no clear moment where danger officially begins. Instead, Unease accumulates slowly through absences. No fire rings, no trash, no casual traces of other people. The clearing feels too clean, and that detail matters. It suggests that something isn't wrong in an obvious way, just incomplete. And that's often how real danger presents itself. Not as chaos, but as order without context. The idea of counting is especially powerful because it strips fear of emotion and replaces it with procedure. Being hunted is terrifying, but being measured is worse. Measurement implies patience, repetition, and precedent. It suggests that what is happening has happened before and will happen again, regardless of the individual involved. That removes the comfort of uniqueness. The narrator isn't special. He's not chosen. He's simply the next variable in a system that already exists. This is where the story becomes less about survival and more about awareness. The figures in the woods don't rush. They don't escalate immediately. They don't need to. Their power comes from restraint, and that restraint is what changes the narrator permanently. Even after returning to civilization, to highways, coffee shops, fluorescent lights, the sense of being observed doesn't vanish. Because once you understand that observation doesn't require proximity, you can't unlearn it. What I find most compelling is that the story never suggests the narrator is broken afterward. He continues working. He lives. He functions. But something subtle has shifted in him, and that feels deeply true to real life. Trauma doesn't always explode. Sometimes it recalibrates us. It changes how silence feels, how we interpret stillness, how long we're willing to stay in places that don't feel right. There's also an unexpectedly constructive message embedded in the fear. The story doesn't punish curiosity, it punishes dismissal. The moments of greatest danger aren't when the narrator is afraid, but when he talks himself out of fear. When he tells himself he's imagining things. When he stays longer to prove something to himself. In that sense, the story validates intuition without romanticizing paranoia. It draws a careful line between fear that immobilizes and awareness that protects. The ending, in particular, is effective because it refuses closure. We're conditioned to expect resolution, answers, explanations, an ending that tells us exactly what happened and why. But real unease doesn't work that way. Real fear often ends without punctuation. It just follows us home by leaving the count unresolved. The story reflects a reality many people recognize. Some experiences don't conclude. They continue quietly, shaping how we move through the world. And yet, despite all this, the story is not hopeless. The narrator leaves. He survives. He learns. He adapts. He respects limits he didn't know existed before. That's not defeat. That's growth through awareness. The fear doesn't dominate him. It informs him. It teaches him discernment, patience, and the courage to walk away without needing proof or validation. In that way, the story becomes less about horror and more about attention, about listening to environments, to patterns, to the subtle internal signals we often ignore because they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. It suggests that wisdom isn't always loud and safety isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, the most important skill we have is knowing when to stop, when to leave, and when to accept that not every place is meant to be understood. Perhaps the most unsettling idea the story leaves us with is not that someone was counting, but that counting itself may never stop. That observation isn't tied to a location, but to awareness. Once you notice patterns, You can't unknow them. Once you realize that systems exist beyond your understanding, you move differently through the world. And maybe that's the real transformation. Not fear, but humility. The humility to recognize that not everything invites us in. The humility to trust our instincts without demanding evidence. The humility to leave quietly without insisting on answers. Question for you. Have you ever experienced a moment, place, relationship, or decision where nothing was obviously wrong, yet something inside you said you should leave? And did listening to that instinct change how you see the world afterward?